Ok, dobar dan svima. Dragi koleginice i kolege, dobrodošli na našu radionicu koja se bavi sa novim pravcima u filozofiji uma i kognitivne nauke. Ispred svog instituta društvenih nauka želim da poželim dobrodošlicu. Hvala i publici koja je danas došla po ovom vremenu da nas sluša. Ideja koja je vodila mene i koleginicu Vanju u praktičnom smišljanju i ovog događaja koje smo želeli da organizujemo na institutu je da nam je potrebno više ovakvih zajedničkih skupova između filozofa, naučnika, pa i praktičara, kliničara, da bismo što više pojačali diskusiju između ovih disciplina, razmenili ideje, omogućili networking između ovih profesionalaca, između ovih stručnjaka. Ideja je svakako bila i da uključimo što više stručnjaka i naših kolega i koleginica iz zemalja u regionu, tako da smo osmislili praktično kao jedan regionalni naučni skup. Ili radionicu, ja je uporno zovem konferencijom, iako to nije, mada imamo već dovoljan broj učesnika za tako nešto, ali opet, kažem, ideja je bila da u jednoj kamernoj, intimnijoj i prijatnijoj atmosferi pozovemo svoje prijatelje i saradnike da razmenjujemo ideje prosto i učimo jedni od drugih i nekako napredujemo u ono čime se bavimo. Pošto smatramo da bez obzira što nam se možda čini da površinski se različite discipline bave nekim različitim istraživanjima, problemi koji stoji iza toga, ti problemi, mnogo širi problemi svesti, kognicije, jezika, porekla jezika i tako dalje, poremećaja svesti i kognicije, nas nekako ujedinjuju i samo u zajedničkom dijalogu između filozofa i nekih više teorijskih istraživanja i praktičnih empirijskih istraživanja možemo doći do nekih boljih rezultata napretku istraživanja ovih problema. Htio bih da se pre svega zahvalim svom institutu društvenih nauka, dakle direktoru Bašiću, mom centru za filozofiju, već našeg instituta koje je na neki način prepoznalo ideju koju smo imali za ovu organizaciju, za ovaj skup i prihvatilo da bude mesto sastanka svih ovih stručnjaka. Organizacija skupa je u saradnji između mog instituta društvenih nauka i instituta za filozofiju Filozofskog fakulteta Univerziteta u Beogradu, ispred koga je u stvari moja koleginica, doktorka Vanja Subotić, naučna saradnica sa Instituta za filozofiju i takođe uz podršku Udruženja za filozofiju i istoriju nauke, čiji smo i neki od učesnika. Ostavljam Vanju da možda kaže još neku reč o temama koje možete se baviti na ovom skupu, takva od predavanja, izlaganja možete očekivati u ova 2 dana. Hvala još jednom što ste ovdje, nadamo se da ste sutra i da ćete imati dobru diskusiju na radionici / konferenciji. Hvala.
Kao što je Janko pomenuo, u stvari, naravno imali smo vrlo, s jedne strane, profesionalnu motivaciju za organizovanje ovako nečega i u suštini nadamo se da će ovo biti neki probni balon za možda i nešto u većem formatu u narednim godinama, gde bismo okupili još veći skup interdisciplinarnih eksperata na ove slične teme. Još jedan vid motivacije koji je bio jeste što prethodna školska godina je za sve nas i za sve profesije koje su ovde zastupljene bila jako teška, kako naravno i po našem univerzitetu, tako i po društvu u celini, i ovo je i organizovano u jednoj nadi da ćemo ovu školsku godinu krenuti u nekom malo optimističnijem duhu. I opet nadamo se u stvari da će ovo biti jedan od događaja u narednom periodu koji će možda nam pomoći da se možda malo vratimo u tokove na koje smo navikli. Dakle, mi smo se fokusirali na ovoj radionici, skupu, konferenciji, fokusirali smo se na, da kažemo, u stvari 2 glavna pravca. Jedan pravac je saradnja između psihijatara i filozofa, pre svega u polju pojmovnih problema u psihijatriji i pojmovnog pristupa, dakle, samoj psihijatriji. A drugi deo jeste posvećen u stvari više jeziku i metodologiji proučavanja raznoraznih aspekata tog kognitivnog procesa, dakle procesiranja jezika. I tu je, dakle, možda više fokus na perspektivi psihologa i filozofa. Po prirodi stvari, što verovatno nije ni začuđujuće, to je izabrano zbog prosto toga čime se Janko i ja bavimo. Da, krajnje oportunistički. U svakom slučaju, nadamo se da će vam biti zanimljivo. Danas je možda malo, u stvari i danas i sutra pokušavali smo da imamo nekako izbalansiran raspored, bude i jedno i drugo zastupljeno. Sada ćemo početi sa baš filozofijom psihijatrije, a sutra će možda opet malo više fokus biti na jeziku, ali negde, da kažemo, to je izbalansirano. Nadamo se da će vam biti zanimljivo i pozivamo vas da učestvujete aktivno u diskusiji, jer manje više svi učesnici će izlagati nešto što je trenutno, prosto da kažemo, nedopečeno. U smislu, svi mi radimo aktivno na tome, tako da nam feedbackite kako znači, i stoga smo i ciljali neku neformalnu kamernu atmosferu, da bi u stvari to bila više razmena ideja. Naravno, mi filozofi pre svega nam znači feedback eksperata koji se bavi baš specifično tom naukom, da smo mi opet nekako iz uloge filozofa nauke. Tako da, zato vas pozivamo da učestvujete u diskusiji i da prosto kod nas filozofa nema glupih pitanja, tako da da, samo glupi odgovor. Tako da ne bude tu neke treme ili nelagodnosti, nema potrebe za tim, naše sve bude. U suštini možemo već da najavimo prvo plenarno predavanje. Imam veoma posebnu čast i zadovoljstvo da vam najavim profesora doktora Luku Malatestija sa sveučilišta u Rijeci, sa departmana za filozofiju. Međutim, profesor Malatesti je takođe jedan od predavača na novoosnovanom master programu iz kognitivne nauke u Rijeci, koji je prvi takav program u regionu. I to je, recimo, jedna od stvari na koje bi trebalo da se ugledamo na Rijeku. Takođe, zašto mi je na što sam rekla baš posebna čast, budući da je ova radionica upravo prilika da se više diskutuje između filozofa i empirijskih naučnika, mislim da mi u regionu za teme filozofije, psihijatrije, nemamo bolju osobu da nas predstavi na pravi način kao filozofe i kako to u stvari treba raditi da se ne izgubi identitet filozofa, dakle da mi ostanemo ono što jesmo, ali da opet pokažemo zavidan nivo i erudicije i preciznosti, da možemo opet da ponudimo nešto u empirijskoj nauci. Tako da, profesor Malatesti,
evo, hvala puno na organizatorima, fantastične riječi, hvala puno za posebno međusta reći, hvala ću raditi što mogu najbolje. Evo, sam samo želio dodati da stvarno filozofija psihijatrije u Rijeci je postala na neki način važna, zašto imamo kolege iz perspektive normativne, dio filozofije politike i etike, i imamo kolege iz perspektive filozofija znanosti koji se bavi tematike povezane sa filozofijom psihijatrije. I na neki način to je moje izlaganje, ali na neki način dosta ideje, pristup koji ja imam danas, malo je rezultat što radimo u Rijeci. Evo, onda stvarno mi je izuzetno drago da mogu imati feedback iz kolega koji su kliničari i ostali filozofi, da mogu poboljšati i testirati neke ideje. Evo, čekam slide. Izvolite. My talk, the title is Psychiatric Normative Consideration of Operationalization. This work is the result of research I've done in Berlin at the Center for Advanced Studies in Humanities, Human Abilities, and also supported by a project that we have in a philosophical analysis with cognitive science. So the problem is how we could characterize the notion of psychiatric harm. The background for this problem recently that is rather debated by philosophers or psychiatrists, but also psychiatrists, is the fact that in the DSM-5, the new recent version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, there is a change concerning the general definition of mental disorder. And this change concerns the notion of the role of the harm notion within the notion of mental disorder. And this is the kind of small change, but for philosophers rather significant. So the idea is that mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability. And many philosophers read this general definition, this claim, this adverb, as implying that harm is not any longer a logical necessary condition for a condition to be a mental disorder. There is also debate whether or not this reading is correct, but here I assume that there is something in this idea that DSM-5 in relation to the previous version of DSM weakens the notion of harm. And some people support the idea that harm shouldn't be a necessary condition for mental disorder, and the majority of philosophers sees that this is not a good move. I argue with this last group of philosophers that in DSM and similar manuals, we should have harm as a necessary condition. But then I argue also that it's true that those critics, or those who support the idea to remove harm as a necessary condition, are right in pinpointing that the notion of harm in DSM is not enough specified. And so I would like to provide a general normative framework to think through how we should define the notion of harm. And I would say that the core of this approach should be to define harm as something that we work out by respecting the widest range of what I call admissible conception of the good life. And then also I stress the role of inabilities or inability within this notion of harm. And this would say that a person is harmed in a psychiatric relevant way when is harmed by inabilities to form a pursue admissible conception of the good life. So these are my main pieces. So I will tell you first something about the methodology that I use that is called conceptual engineering or conceptual explication. Then I will move on this idea of the need for a normative framework for justifying the conception that we want to use. The central role of inability in this conception is psychiatric harm. They also tried very, very indicative, just fingering pointing towards a way to operationalize this notion of harm. So, you may be familiar, if you are not, on trying to tell you, maybe most basic moves. There is no consensus in the philosophy of psychiatry whether or not a condition has to be harmful to the patient, to the person, in order to be a mental disorder. At least in the philosophical and philosophical debate, this issue is really divisive. One side you have the naturalists that they say that the notion of mental disorder shouldn't involve a notion of harm because they think that it's enough to point to biological function or other naturalistic notions that don't involve the notion of harm. But on the other side, in the philosophical debate, you have people in the so-called normative camp that they say, no, a mental disorder should involve harmful components insofar these are deviations from value-related standards. For example, some philosophers argue that a mental disorder is harmful because it interferes with standards of agency or standards of human function. So those standards represent some kind of value-laden element in the emotional mental disorder. Also, there are theorists who endorse the hybrid view that despite you need a naturalistic component in the notion of mental disorder, usually dysfunction, and this dysfunction usually understood in biological terms, at the same time, a dysfunction per se is not medically relevant. It should also be a harmful dysfunction. This is, for example, the theory of Wakefield that probably is the most influential theory where mental disorder and harmful dysfunction somehow Wakefield approach to mental disorder characterized the account of mental disorder that you find in DSM-4, not in DSM-5, because exactly it seems to be the DSM-5 weakens the idea that harm is a necessary component of disorder. But what is the interesting issue now with DSM-5? All those philosophers in the debate that I present, they use so-called descriptive analytic philosophy. Their aim is through testing linguistic intuitions about the correct application of a concept, in this case, mental disorder. They try to work out how to define what is the understanding of the notion of mental disorder that we share, ordinary speakers, or the experts share. So they try to give a kind of descriptive account how people think about the notion of mental disorder. But this, of course, is relevant. Of course, it's relevant to understand how people or the experts understand the notion of mental disorder if we want to establish how to define it inside the DSM. Because, of course, if you introduce a definition that departs dramatically from ordinary understanding of a concept, DSM or other manuals can lose their authority or usability because different people may have a different understanding. However, DSM-5, many authors, philosophers who analyze the progression or the definition of the concept in DSM-5 of mental disorder, they recognize that in reality, the committees who came up with this general definition, they were not so interested in tracking ordinary understanding of the concept of mental disorder. They were more focused in kind of providing revisions of concepts that would be useful for the work of theoreticians, experimental people involved in psychiatry, and of course, people involved in the clinical work. So that already, since the DSM is not so close to the methods of descriptive analytic philosophy. So there were more kind of pragmatic aims who were pushing the definition of mental disorder and the notion of harm as a necessary component. So if this is true, the implication is that maybe the work done by analytic philosophers, though very relevant, may not say the last word on the definition of mental disorder. Maybe we need other methods. And here, one method that seems to be appropriate to try to think how we should define mental disorder is so-called conceptual engineering, or also conceptual explication. So, the conceptual analysis may have problem in addressing expert pragmatic-driven changes in psychiatry. There is even the stronger line that say descriptive methods lack normative force in defining mental disorder. I don't really want to enter in this kind of complex philosophical debate about general methodology, but in a sense, DSM-5 seems to be guided more by a visionary, pragmatic consideration than just philosophical, analytical accuracy. Plus, there is a lot of interesting philosophical work that still tries to give a contribution to the definition of mental disorder by introducing pragmatic considerations and goals in building or revising concepts that can be useful to the working psychiatrist. So this seems to me recommends trying to see what we can do by using conceptual engineering. If you endorse conceptual engineering or conceptual explication, you have two main steps to do as a philosopher. And not only as a philosopher, because we'll see many other agents and specialists can be included. The first step is to do what is called conceptual choice. This is a term by Elisabetta Romero that is in our recent publication promoting this type of approach. So the conceptual choice moment is to identify, assess, and eventually revise the goals of the engineer concept. And so we have to focus on the goals relevant to the specific practice. So we should consider expert declaration, regulation, ethics codes, institutional aims. This would give us a kind of pragmatic adequacy of our concept. But also, a philosopher may justify what are really the aims of the discipline we are focusing, in this case, psychiatry. The second step is the engineering of explication. Once we have dissected those things we want to do, let's build theoretically a concept that help us to achieve those goals. So that's the difference from the descriptive analytic approach. From this perspective, from the engineering perspective, it seems we have very robust reasons to endorse the idea that harm must be a necessary condition for the concept of mental disorder. Here, some authors give convincing reason, I think, that harms helps to ground the goal of using the concept of mental disorder as a ground, as a reason, a pro tanto reason for treatment, for intervention, for seeking treatment, and for giving treatment. Pro tanto here means that is not an absolute reason. It's not enough to have a mental disorder and be harmed to be treated. There could be other reasons for not treating or different reasons for different ways of treating. But it's a consideration that is central to the concept of mental disorder. If you have a mental disorder, you have good reasons to seek treatment. And here, of course, these authors, I agree with them, they say in this way, the concept of mental disorder aligns with the ground duty in medical practice that is beneficent towards the patient. So we think that this is one reason. Of course, as I said, the justification for seeking or giving treatment is not absolute, especially, in cases where you have to enforce treatment is not enough for the person as a mental disorder. Law, morality may dictate other conditions that needs to satisfy in order to intervene for involuntary treatment. But just the concept of mental disorder should include this prescriptive element. If you have a mental disorder, you have, as a patient, a reason to search for help, and the institution have a reason to treat or to decide alternative to treatments or to decide treatment alternatives. Why we want harm inside the concept of mental disorder? The second reason, the strong reason, it again really comes from the pragmatic consideration concerning the history of psychiatry, is to have a concept who can block and justify pathologization, justify application of medical methods to conditions that don't involve really a medical problem. And you all know the DSM-3, the harm criteria was introduced in DSM-3 to block, for example, the medicalization of homosexuality. Homosexuality is a condition that whatever the causes is not harmful to the person having them. Therefore, there is no ground for medicalize that condition. So that is already in the pragmatics and the history of DSM, the idea that harm blocks pathologication, especially when it's on a repressive nature. Next. Linking harm to mental disorders also may be very helpful in preventing inappropriate self-diagnosis. And this is probably a problem that is growing in our society due to the availability of psychiatric information. And so this awareness about the possibility that you have a mental disorder, of course, is great. We raise the capacity of people to be sensitive to this type of problems, but at the same time, we need ways to block excessive self-medicalization or excessive treatment. If you connect with the notion of mental disorder, a robust notion of harm, you may also reduce, because it's not enough, for example, to fulfill the symptoms of depression per se to be quite a relevant depression, maybe you are also to be harmed by that condition. And so we think that harm also does this role. In addition, of course, theoretically, we could start a human condition in a vacuum. We may do our scientific research where we cover all the possible variation in human behavior, finding all the causes. That's plausible in theoretical terms, but that's not the reality. The reality is that we should focus on those conditions that are really harmful. So that harm also has a role inside the scientific practice to focus exactly on those conditions, in prioritizing the study of conditions that are harmful to people. Though there will be no harmful variations of a condition, they may be useful to be studied because we can gather some information. But again, the grounding for that type of research is that those studies may help to alleviate the harm involved in the condition we are interested in. Finally, there is also some scientific grounding in the idea that if you have a notion of harm, you can also have a better understanding of how mental disorders are in society. Assume the DSM-3 was out, DSM-3 was offering more specific operationalization of the symptoms of different disorders. They started to do epidemiology to try to see how these disorders were distributed in the population, and they were using also self-assessment. Given that these diagnostic symptoms were not in those tests, in those foods, they were not based on clear-cut account of the harmfulness of this condition. This result of this research gave more people suffering certain disorder than the expert would say was their experience, because of course people tended to self-declare having a mental disorder without considering how they were harmed by that condition. So there are also this kind of consideration why harm can help us to keep things under control in terms of the knowledge. Okay, so it seems harm should be part of the concept of mental disorder. But now the problem is which notion of harm? If you look in DSM, in the general definition, or if you go down, because DSM has a very general definition of mental disorder, but sometimes the harm may appear in specific symptoms or specific disorders. If you try to work out what is harm, what are the distress or inability that DSM talks about, you don't find any final description. They are left as intuitively. So it seems many of the people who are happy that DSM-5 removes harm from the general definition, the argument is exactly yes, we should remove this notion of harm because distress and inability are such general terms, they are so ill specified that we would work much better if we don't use at all these terms. Given the consideration I gave you, I think we must use a notion of harm, but at the same time, we have to define it more precisely. What kind of problems we are if we want to define this notion of psychiatric harm more precisely? It seems that one dialectic that we cannot avoid, in a sense, is a dialectic that we find also inside the history of psychiatry, is this tension between personal and societal norms. Personal are internal norms guiding self-assessment of people about their own suffering or not suffering, being harmed or being harmed, when they are conditioned. Societal are norms that regulate behavior. They can be laws, that can be customs, that can be based on culture. Sometimes these two set of standards align. Consider the case a person with depression. The person recognizes that this condition is harmful to her. Also, society goes along. Also, society will judge that a person with a type of condition is harm. In this case, there is not a big tension. It's harm from the perspective of the person, it's harm from the perspective of society. But you know better than me that divergence between personal standards and social standards characterize many conditions or variations of many psychiatric conditions. So you may have cases of individuals who lack insight about the nature of their conditions, so they cannot appreciate whether the condition is harm. You can have even patients of people who endorse their condition not as harmful explicitly. or there are even people who actively want to achieve the aims and the preferences that they may have due to the condition. So, how we handle this? One tradition in philosophy is to say, no, whatever the perspective of individuals, we should first start from what society concerned regards as harmful. And so Wakefield in 1992, where he proposes dysfunction, harmful analysis of the concept of mental disorder, he proposed this idea that we should base the notion of what is harmful in psychiatry to general distributed social norms. In a sense, this goes along with the DSM not specifying too much the notion of harm. This move, this simple cultural relativism, that what is harmful depends on the value of the society and of the story, of course, may have problems. The first problem that how we pinpoint, how we find these standards, these normative standards. Societies have different views on what is harmful. It's enough to consider anti-psychiatry or neurodivergent movements that we see that there is debate within our society, for example, what should we consider harmful condition, what should consider a normal variation in nature. Of course, we have the problem that also Wakefield recognized that society may converge in standards that at the end of the day are oppressive. Homosexuality is an example, political dissident is another example, women in certain societies are another example, or instances where due certain social standards of normality, some variation were considered pathological. So this is not a good idea to anchor our notion of harm and naked, mere social responses or social standards. Another option, of course, philosophers like Saussure, is to try to give a proper justification of this standard. So, okay, we may consider society, but we need a wider philosophical grounded foundational story that tell us, okay, these things are harmful in a psychiatric relevant way, and these are not. And so, the need for a proper disvaluation of certain things. So we need some kind of justification why, for example, of depression is bad or harmful. So this approach rejects the weak normativism that you find in Wakefield to just say, look what the society say. It demands fitting normative justification. So you have to find some story that can tell us exactly what are the values that should inform the standards for determining whether or not these are harmful conditions. Though Wakefield occurred recently, they say, okay, maybe Wakefield said, okay, my account was too simple. But at the same time, we have to be very careful here. We don't want to introduce political or philosophical debates in defining what is harm in psychiatry. They say we have objectivity that should come from the scientific side of the standard mental disorder and therefore dysfunction. But again, we don't want to introduce too much variation in the social standards. And they have this intriguing position. They say, look, it's not that we have to look at the immediate social responses to a condition to determine whether or not it's harmful. We need something more reflective. And Wakefield gives the example, the historical example of the demedicalization of homosexuality. They say there, that society in the 70s, they were capable to find deeper normative guidelines for deciding that homosexuality was not harmful. There was a realization that this condition wasn't involving harm to other people, and people with this condition were capable to live satisfactory lives. And so this kind of internal to the culture of the time, the reflection produced the standards that allow homosexuality. So no immediate social responses, they may converge into oppression. more mediate, more culturally reflective values. So it seems to me that if we go down that way, we still have a problem, an open problem. How we refine, how we go down in building such a self-corrective model? Do we have ways, philosophical, that at the same time take care of the shared cultural environment to build these standards? For example, Powell and Stratford, they go down with this idea that harm standards in psychiatry must be based on rational justification. For example, they say, if you have a person who suffers, is harmed because he's incapable to align to the requirement of an oppressive religion, that shouldn't be psychiatric harm. We have to change that specific. If someone suffers because it's the results of standards based on bigotry, we shouldn't legalize. So they say that racism, homophobia, biological falsehood, dogmatism shouldn't be the grounds for building the standards to decide whether or not someone is harmed or condition. And they say they don't do the job because all these are irrational positions. So they put rationality as something that should decide whether or not a condition is harm. If it's grounded on rational standards, the idea that a condition is harmful, we should not reject it. Though rationality is kind of heavy-duty concept here, and basically the current just make the simple move. But look, in our society, a psychiatry may have a legitimate duty to cure a person who belongs to a certain religious group. He wants really to align to those requirements, and his condition doesn't allow the person due to some internal mechanism to align to those requirements. And that religion doesn't have to be rational. In our contemporary liberal society, we don't restrict, for example, religion or aesthetic aspiration in the base of their rationality. So the proposal by Powell's is too restrictive in relation to the overall factors around us. So we need something less demanding. A less demanding position, I think I take 5 minutes more because a less demanding position is to go towards well-being. Instead of focusing on general standards of justification, let's focus on the well-being of people. One option is that as philosophers, we find an account what is for a person to have well-being, to flourish. For example, some philosophers use Aristotle, so the idea that you flourish as a person if across the stages of your life you reach that level of rationality that, according to Aristotle, is essential for you to have a fulfilling life. And if a psychiatric condition blocks you in this flourishing, you are harmed by that condition. Again, it seems to base in our complex society the idea of psychiatric harm, one philosophical view about what is human flourishing, again, it seems to be problematic. Some philosophers involved in this type of criticism, they say, but look, there is not single acceptable, reasonable view of the good life in our complex, pluralistic society. Even if there was such a true theory that really tell us, oh, look, for human beings to flourish, that's what they should do. Even in that case, I think in our pluralist society, we should give people the opportunity to choose differently. But we have to provide constraints. These constraints, I think, should come from a kind of general liberal framework that, with colleagues, I think, shapes at least our democratic society, shapes important general normative documents about human rights and so on and so forth. And here, the core idea is that people has the freedom as much as possible to choose what they consider to be a good life. And the only restraints, the minimality, constraint is that they should engage in conceptual good lives that involve harming others. Again, what does it mean, harming others? Societies have rich system, a repertoire of law, codex, norms to fix when you're harming someone without a justification. But just we need this general framework to guide how we understand. And I think that this restrictive permissible conception aligns intuitively with what psychiatrists should do. For example, you can have a person with a pedophilic disorder, and this person is harmed because he cannot fulfill his desire. So society blocks his fulfilling those desires. I think the intuition that we should cure the person in order to allow the person to satisfy those desires is wrong. We should try to find component of the conception of good life of that person to justify treatment. For example, the person with this condition cannot have a normal life, cannot get a job, got in trouble with the law. So the idea is that the ground for intervention is not that he has an inadmissible conception of the good life, and we should help him to achieve that conception. We have to find other component of what this person may like to do in his life in order to have a ground of medical intervention. This normative justification is liberal and procedural. Just tell us, okay, we should try to see people with conditions, see how this condition impacts on their conception of the good life, allow the widest class possible of conception of good life with the restriction that they have to be admissible, meaning they shouldn't have others. It's rather cultural specific, as I said. This incorporates some general principles characterize Western society, but at the same time, it doesn't tell us exactly what are those conceptions of the good life that people may like to see. Just it filters out unjust conception of good life. Though, of course, it is clear that this account is a bit external to the perspective of the patient. And there are patients who cannot express a conception of good life. Others hold harmful or defectively formed conception. So we risk that we have nothing to say about these patients. But I think that there are several ways of idealizing the situation. One is to try to think, for example, you have an anorexic person who may have at the core of her conception, this conception of good life, this aspiration to have a perfect fit body. We may try to see whether the person has other preferences besides this central preference. Reasonably, that you can ascribe to the person. So, for example, the person may have a preference, interest not to have the people around them, the people take care about them. So that preference could be something that we may use to justify the idea that the person in our experience has. Even if she maybe doesn't recognize the contradiction between the idea of perfect body and harming others. There are also other ways of idealization. And now just the last bit. Though not all harmful conditions that involve departure from these justified standards of fulfilling or pursuing acceptable conception of the good life should be medicalized. Grief, aging, failure, risky jobs, crime, all these things involve harms to make departure in the standards. So we need something more precise. And I think that what can help us to make this notion more precise is the idea of incapability. So we get to the concept of harm as an incapability to pursue admissible conception of the good life. The inability does the job of distinguishing between many sources of harms that are medically relevant and harms that are relevant. Because inability seems to capture the idea that the normative ground for treatment is that the condition is beyond the control of the patient. And without implying though that the person with a mental disorder are completely enabled, especially in protective context, they may be capable to function, but the idea is that in any case the condition must be fixed. Degree of inability. Okay, I think I stop here. I have some ideas how to operationalize this notion more detailed, but I think that we might give your feedback on this general assumption, because if this assumption doesn't work, there is no point to go down here. We could go to rationalization. So just to complete my account, psychiatric harm should be grounded in a liberal normative standards, is a necessary condition for defined mental disorder. This harm has to arise from psychological inabilities that impair the pursuit of an admissible conception of good life, and this can occur under ordinary life challenges. This account prevents overpathologization, resists repressive norms, respects limits, evaluative pluralism. But also I want to conclude with the idea, I'm just giving the harm as a necessary condition. I'm not arguing that that would be enough. So I'm not saying that a harmful condition, in the sense I specify, must be a mental disorder. Maybe we need other factors like dysfunction, other sorts of inabilities. I'm not entering in the topic. That's
So we open the floor for discussion. You can ask questions in either English or
Yes.
Serbian, but I guess the professor would prefer to answer in English.
Yeah,
It's a bit easier because of the terminology. So, and people online, of course. So we'll first cover this room, then people online. Ethan?
Okay. Hello, my name is Milutin Kostic. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I had some associations. I'm very interested in overdiagnosis and overtreatment. So this is something that I was hoping you would tackle, and you tried. But I am a bit skeptical in the regards that I clearly have patients in my head that I've seen, for instance, with dealing with neurodiversity and adult concept or adult recognized ADHD, with the notion of clearly, like you talked, what is the good life I want to lead, was through the diagnosis, there was an explanation why some things weren't achieved. A patient of mine said, I forget keys more than the average person. How much does the average person forget keys? No one knows. But this is something that's, again, there's, I feel, a clearly subjective notion of what is a good life, which is culturally, again, something that is very, very imposed on us through social media, through, and we have some data that shows that the social media are raising, for instance, in some, especially the girls, raising feelings of unworth or not being able to complete the good life, as you call it. So this feels like there's still a lot of room for overpathologization of either societal ills or feelings of inadequacy in a society that is presenting something that's unachievable. So yeah.
Yes, much good question. So maybe a distinction place in so here the proposal is to think about working out a general definition of mental disorder. And so the idea is that what should guide the general definition is this focus on the perspective of the patient and what is an admissible conception of the good life. And this admissibility we saw shouldn't excludes harm to others from the perspective of our culture. At the same time, this admissibility or the kind of conception of the life we want to accept, they should be really sensitive to the overall cultural climate. To me, I see the side of your question, meaning, but sometimes people endorse values and standards that are questionable. But the point is, who should choose about this questionability? Still, I see there is a traction in that idea that we don't want to politicize medicine. So here is a difficult dialectic. But I would say that in a sense, tracking what society considers to be values or these values, we may maybe talk with the person side to give other perspective. For example, critical stances towards consumerism are, or a certain way of appearing, are constitutive of our culture. So these are admissible considerations that we can give to the person to try to articulate a better conception of the good life. But I would say the focus in any case, it should be on the perspective of the person. And the psychiatrist may have this role in helping the person to check whether or not the formation of the conception of good life is okay. But as a philosopher, I don't think we could give something stronger than that. So unfortunately, I'm not really give you an answer, though I think that this operationalization already would help the experts in trying maybe to work out more precise notion of how to put in the DSM, not to leave it on the burden of the clinician who has by himself to decide. I see the problem, but still I see there is not alternative. We cannot go down maybe with, okay, let's say female 16-year-old in this society must do this and that if you deviate. So yeah, it's a tough one. Thank you so much. Plus, let me add, of course, you go down, we have a general definition of depression is a harmful condition because in normal conditions interferes with forming and pursuing admissible conception of the good life. That's a definition to keep depression in DSM. How this definition interacts with the clinical interaction with the patient, how we should, because maybe the patients are some kind of economic, socioeconomic, cultural factors that protects her or him from the worst consequences of depression. Maybe in that case, yes, she has the disorder according to the general definition. Maybe we shouldn't medicalize. Maybe the person has enough protective factors. Again, I cannot prescribe all these elements, but I think in any case, the reason it should be guided, he has enough protective factors to live what the person, as much as we can, perceives as the conception of good life she wants to live. So just a kind of focusing. More than that.
Thank you.
I cannot tell you, but thank you for the important question.
Thank you for that. So, Mika.
Please. Well, listen, I'm sorry, I'm not accustomed to such devices. Thank you for very interesting and very stimulating talk. Correct me if I don't have, at first place, I don't have any background in psychiatry. So perhaps my questions would sound naive to colleagues, psychiatrists, but correct me if I'm wrong. You conceive psychological harm as the necessary condition for diagnosing. But in your talk, I hadn't seen clearly the sufficient condition. For instance, only at the slide, I don't recall the number, but the title was Emerging Psychological Harm. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it is the first time that the word others, and the concept of others is mentioned. And I think that your view is perhaps too personally centered to a harm that is perceived and experienced by individual. You have mentioned one example of pedophilia. And then again, you explained it in terms, perhaps this person is lacking something that we, let's call us normal people lack. But where is the point? Where is the point when harm done to the others enters definition of psychopathological entity? For instance, addictions, alcoholism. You have alcoholism and some emerging concept. I believe that psychiatrists would dismiss it of functional alcoholic. When does perhaps addiction becomes nosological entity? Because there are others included, and you have perfectly happy alcoholics. Not perfectly happy, but well, I guess. I think it's clear.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, just to clarify, in philosophy, we like to divide things. So the first thing, this account tries to engineer the notion of psychiatric harm. It doesn't try to engineer the overall notion of mental disorder, because it could really be that this account of harm requires some sufficient conditions. So, for example, it's not enough to be incapable to fulfill your conception of good life that is admissible, but also you need some biological dysfunction. So the biological dysfunction may do some job in fixing exactly whether or not we have a disorder. So in this case, I accept that my account is not complete, lacks the sufficient. But then there is another line in your question that is very intriguing, is the issue how we recognize the perspective of the agent, because it's clear we cannot go down completely in giving complete authority to the agent in relation with or not this harm, because psychiatry shows us this kind of situations where the perspective of the agent either is the formation of that conception of good life is a result of the condition, or maybe may embrace some kind of cultural factors to the previous question. So I propose a small important element of idealization. Idealization. We don't find anything shocking about idealization in relation to symptoms. No, in DSM, you may say, okay, if you are depressed, you have these symptoms, but those are idealizations. So I think we should have some kind of similar approach in the general definition about the notion of harm. So the person who has addiction that really satisfies his conception of good life. There is not any clear element of interference with that conception. The person, here we are talking about the specific case, lives in an environment where that condition doesn't imply any harm. It could even be the drinking result from some kind of dysfunction. But if you don't have enough grounds for saying that this condition undermines admissible conception of good life, I think the condition shouldn't be medicalized. So in that case, we may follow the perspective of the agent, but we can have another person with this kind of similar behavior and biology that for some other surrounding condition may really be harmed, including his incapacity to fulfill his duties, his work duties, things that really values. In that case, we would have a. So I don't think there is a final answer, but this is what you would expect once you are serious about harm in your definition. But again, it's very important to think about idealizations. For example, I was thinking, you take the anorexic, you see that the person has one desire for perfection in his body or her body, their body. But then you can see that the person really has a preference not to hurt other people around. Then she can even not recognize the contradiction. But we have, at least as external observers, some ground for saying, look, yeah, you may pursue this kind of ideal of perfection, but at the same time, there are these consequences that in the light of our culture seems block your capacity to fulfill all your aspiration. Therefore, as a psychiatrist, I have a ground for intervening. Plus, again, I'm talking about whether or not we are facing a mental disorder, whether we should forcibly intervene requires other consideration. Harm gives a pro tanto reason, meaning this reason is defeasible if there are other considerations. And so it does not imply forced treatment. But that's what happened in our society. Forced treatment is regulated by special laws. It's not implicit in DSM that if you satisfy the condition that DSM says are disorder, you must be forcibly treated. So I accept my account recognize the perspective of the agent by introducing idealization. My account is not necessarily sufficient. You may need to load also other factors. But yeah, there is this variation. You can have two individuals with the same symptoms, but then the harm judgment will make the difference whether or not one is disordered and the other is not. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is related to the degree of harm, because it can be the same harm can be present very little or more to a bigger and bigger degree. And the second one concerns values, because you say minimally acceptable values. But I wonder whether that's the same kind of trap that we have, for example, in the psychology of moral development, when we try to see what is more morally developed or less, and look for ways to find neutral, universal criteria. And then these theories end up as showing that the culture of the person who made the scale is more developed than other more different cultures.
Fantastic. If I may, okay, the slides, if you could please. Okay, in relation to degree, of course, is a serious, is a very serious question, because that would be the concept of clinical significance. One idea that I have, unfortunately, I have not presented, was this idea, but still I don't know how much it applies to you. But let's go down with this. Let's see. Okay. So let's go back to DSM. We know, the expert knows, but in general, we have this sense that when DSM, they introduce a new category as a disorder, there is a lot of scientific work, because we want that the category is validated, reliable, the measurements of the symptoms have to satisfy scientific requirements in building that category that is robust enough for description, prediction, treatment. So the DSM focuses on that, but that's very complicated stuff. And there you have cut points, you have statistical studies that they try to build a category that is scientifically satisfactory. If you go in the harm side of the story, there is nothing. In DSM, there is no any. When they include a condition in DSM, there's not a committee who's going to testing how harmful is the condition. There is a sense, okay, if it's distressful, if it involves inabilities, end of the story. So clearly this is not satisfactory. What is not developed as the symptomatic component of mental disorders developed. So one idea to try to go towards more scalability or operationalization, and also to get to these issues about threshold, how much harm is needed. I think we should go towards connecting DSM with something like the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, the ICF. So this is a manual repertoire description of how each disorder, not necessarily mental disorder, impact functionality in ordinary contexts. So this is used usually for prognosis, to do rehabilitation, to have an idea, for example, if you have this type of tumor, how will it impact in your life, how. So my suggestion would be to try to think hard in the operationalization of harm related to different disorders in these lines. So then the expert may make a list of the, for example, if you have depression, how this impact in your academic success, in your working capabilities, what are the context of work where you can function, not function. Maybe statistically would say, look, for this group of people in this age, that would be the required level of functionality. All this is complex. All this is not defined, but I think is not much different from what you would do when you do the same work for the statistic analysis or whether or not a certain construct is valid in terms of symptoms. So that's the idea. So it's not that I would like to recommend cut points philosophically. I think it's a statistical, empirical, but then all this machinery should be guided by the idea, okay, harm is part, so it wouldn't be any longer the definition of depression, just the symptoms. You should prove that those symptoms through something like ICF impact on the ordinary, statistically, factual capacities that we think people should have in ways that are harmful. That's the only way, I think, to go down for clarity and thresholds. The expert should somehow not leave the clinicians left alone in making these clinical judgments. I think there should be guidance. Given that we can do that in terms of symptoms, then why we cannot do that in terms of the harm component? So I will answer this way. It's not a big answer, it's not a solution, but philosophical, I think, I would point to that direction. Expert will decide cut points as they decide statistical cut points when they say whether or not something is symptomatic. Values. That's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer, though. We can start with mere cultural relativism. There is no way to handle these values, everything goes. Societies tell us what is good, what is bad, and psychiatry comes second and just adjust. So you may have a Nazi society, someone is depressed because he cannot run the extermination camps. You cure him because, okay, society tells me that this person is suffering, is useful to our society, we're going to cure him. That's an option. Or we may try to introduce ways to constrain a cultural relativism. A liberal proposal, as I have, seems to me that is enough grounded on our cultural tradition. The idea that democracy is all about allowing people to have different views on what is the ultimate good. Another idea that seems to be quite embedded in our legal system, that you cannot harm others without a legitimate reason. So these two components should shape the general framework. This is, of course, a Western-oriented approach. It's flexible because it recognizes the kind of pluralism that we recognize in our society. Pluralism in religious, pluralism in metaphysics. I can be Aristotelian, you could be Lockean. We can do that. What about society that don't recognize cultural pluralism? I don't know. I think that the DSM works as forms in this type of context. Maybe there could be local adaptation. But again, psychiatry subscribe to some ethical codes. And these codes, more or less, I think, are responsive to the values of a certain culture. And I think here I'm just pinpointing certain general values. Also, I really like the Wakefield historical lesson. It seems that certain forms of demedicalization went through recognizing this plurality of view. We condemn medicalization of homosexuality in those grounds. We condemn medicalization of political opponents coming from democratic views that diverging from the dominant values of a society for political reason is not a disorder. I think is inevitable. I think it's very dangerous when philosophically or in other ways we try to find the ultimate objective grounds for evaluation. We should, at least our stage, cultural stage, is that we, as a society, we don't recognize one best way to live your life, but we recognize some principle that should regulate us, everyone can reach its best life. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this danger of repressive values is there. But I don't think the solution is to give one objective account for all, is to cultivate this pluralism and opening up our understanding of different perspectives, always tracking whether or not this perspective are really harmful to others or harmful to the individual. Again, I really think it's the lesson of this philosophical debate, going down with one account of heart. Plus, it wouldn't be correct for the psychiatrist to impose that, even if there was a true account. Is it really psychiatry in that business? Or is psychiatry more in the business to try to keep people in line with the society, trying to track the value of society in a critical way, but not in a too political way? So yeah, I'm trying to balance. But yeah, it's an open issue. You can always say, yeah, but what in the specific case? Or yeah, this is a Western grounded perspective. The values they should guide other notions that I cannot tell you. If someone is not convinced, I don't have a special way, a special method. That's it. It's a different culture. Thank you.
Dakle, otvaramo prvu sesiju naše radionice skupa konferencije. Sesija je malo isprekidana jednim plenarnim predavanjem, ali iz praktičnih razloga. U svakom slučaju, sesija je u stvari posvećena fenomenološkoj psihijatriji i ovde imamo jedan trio mladih momaka koji su posvećeni upravo toj oblasti i prvi od njih će biti Stefan Jerotić. Doktor Stefan Jerotić radi na kliničkom centru u klinici za psihijatriju. I što mi volimo da kažemo, Stefan je jedan od najtalentovanijih filozofa među psihijatrima i mi se ne bismo ni malo postideli kada bi bio na jednom od naših instituta, definitivno. I ono što je posebno zanimljivo, Stefan je toliki ljubitelj filozofije da čak dobija redovno kritike na svom poslu da previše svuda trpa filozofiju, ali da nije toga i da opet nije naše saradnje sa njim, mislim da bi prosto mi filozofi bili mnogo siromašniji intelektualno nego što jeste. Stefane, izvoli.
Hvala, Vanja, na ovako divnom uvodu. Velika mi je čast što mogu ovom prilikom da vam se obratim i kao što je Vanja najavila, dakle, zahvaljujem se dr. Ivani Subotić i dr. Janku Nešiću, Institutu za društvene nauke i Institutu za filozofiju Filozofskog fakulteta. Kao što je najavila, dakle, ovo o čemu ja govorim jeste jedan spoj fenomenologije, odnosno fenomenološki okvir i pokušaj spajanja fenomenologije i farmakološkog okvira. Ovde ima dosta sadržaja, ja naravno neću stići, ovo više će da bude pokušaj jednog skiciranja i vrlo bih voleo bilo kakve kritike, komentare, diskusiju da pokrenemo, bilo u okviru ovog dela ili kasnije, zato što ovo jeste jedna nova oblast i ovo je jednostavno u literaturi, koliko meni poznato, nije bilo pokušaja spajanja ove dve tradicije. I ovo je nešto na čemu mi radimo ja, Janko Nešić, Vuk Vuković i Luis Madeira i upravo prošle nedelje nam prihvaćam jedan rad upravo na ovu temu. Dakle, kretaću se brzo. Dakle, prvo ću govoriti o tome kako razumemo primjenu psihofarmaka danas i to će da bude u principu kritika tog razumevanja. Zatim ću da govorim o tome da li je neophodno, odnosno utvrdiću ću da jeste neophodno da postoji čin interpretacije kao konstitutivni deo razvoja uopšte simptoma mentalnog poremećaja. Zatim, ono što je srž samog argumenta jeste da kako psihofarmaci deluju na utelovljeni um, koji, znači, koncept koji potiče iz fenomenologije, i da pokušamo pojasniti kroz koncept kružne uzročenosti koje potiče od Thomasa Fuchsa, kako bi mogli to da spojimo, odnosno objasnimo kako lek zapravo kroz fenomenološku prizmu deluje na um. I na kraju, ukoliko ostane vremena, nešto da kažem o mogućnosti za budućnost, odnosno fenomenološkim profilima psihofarmaka. Dakle, psihofarmakologija, lekovi u psihijatriji, pojednostavljeno rečeno, tradicionalno smatraju se delom biološke psihijatrije. Dakle, podela psihijatrije smatram da bilo koje grane, psihološku, biološku, fenomenološku, je arbitrarno. Znači, mi to jednostavno tako nešto ne postoji. I međutim, znači, zato što mi smatramo da su biološki pojmovi i biološki uopšte način zaključivanja, koji potiče iz prirodno-naučnih metoda pre svega, je onaj koji se uobičajeno koristi za objašnjavanje kako lek uopšte deluje. Neću to sad produbljivati, ali problem sa tim jeste da govorimo onda o organizmu, odnosno o sistemu organa, ajde da kažem sad pojednostavljeno opet govorim, kao cilju lečenja, odnosno leka. Ali kad se vratimo malo nazad i razmotrimo šta je predmet ili objekat psihijatrije, uviđamo da predmet, barem po fenomenolozima, jeste subjekat, odnosno subjektivno iskustvo kao takvo. I znači ono se ne može okarakterisati isključivo kroz biološke koncepte. Tu postoji ta praznina. I fenomenološka dimenzija uopšte, koja se bavi subjektivitetom, je zapostavljena u psihofarmacima, ali je interesantno da kada su u pitanju psihodelici, koji su sada najatraktivnija tema na svim kongresima, tu imamo uticaj fenomenologije, odnosno pokušavaju ljudi da okarakterišu kako su to sržne promene subjektivnog iskustva, kada se uzme psihodelik, ali zapostavljamo da govorimo o tome koje su to sržne promene u subjektivnom iskustvu kod lekova koje mi kao praktičari svakodnevno popisujemo u ogromnim količinama, dakle, antidepresivi, antipsihotici, benzodiazepini, takozvani stabilizatori raspoloženja i tome slično. Znači, nemamo objašnjenja kako oni deluju na subjektivno iskustvo. Sad postoje ti novi pozivi, svega nekoliko godina nazad, dakle, za usklađivanje psihofarmakologije i fenomenologije, dakle, to je sve prilično novo. Zašto kritikujem sada način na koji lekovi deluju? Dakle, kako mi govorimo uopšte, da li je, na osnovu čega zaključujemo da je određen lek efikasan? Dakle, pre svega moramo da razumemo da govorimo da je efikasan za određenu indikaciju. Indikacija podrazumeva određenu dijagnozu, a kako onda dolazimo do te dijagnoze? Dolazimo kroz koncepte kroz naravno opise koji su u međunarodnoj klasifikaciji bolesti u DSM-u, koji su zasnovani na logičkom pozitivizmu, pa ono neću sad ulaziti u to, ali ono što je posledica, s obzirom da se od 80-ih pa na ovamo mi oslanjamo na te diagnostičke kriterije koje se malo menjaju, ali u suštini, njihova suština je u principu ista. Ono do čega je došlo, smatra se, jeste do pojave u struci samoj dijagnostičkoj literalizma. To znači da mi pomešamo ono što smo se dogovorili da su nekakvi dijagnostički kriterijumi sa samom suštinom onoga što je poremećaj. Samo brzo pojašnjenje, dakle mi kažemo neko ima depresiju, ako ima depresivno raspoloženje, ako je bezvoljan, ne uživa u stvarima kojima je uživao, ako se slabo koncentriše, ako ima suicidalne misli ili pokušaje i tako dalje. Ali tu nigde nema one širine i one dubine onoga što mi kao praktičari znamo da jeste depresija, to su promene poput promena uopšte u egzistencijalnoj orijentaciji u svetu, doživljaju vremena, u takozvanoj vitelodjenosti i tako dalje. Znači, to je dimenzija koja je zapostavljena u okviru dijagnostičkih kriterijuma. I tu dolazimo do problema sa lekovima. Jer odluke, kako mi kažemo da lek deluje ili ne, mi imamo određenu indikaciju, dijagnozu prema dijagnostičkim kriterijima i mi onda u vidu randomizovanih kontrolisanih studija dokazujemo da je lek efikasan tako što smanji te simptome. A ti simptomi se zasnivaju na opet psihometrijskim nekakvim standardizovanim skalama. Znači, kada pada skor, mi kažemo da, ovaj lek deluje. I to je, po mom mišljenju, vrlo problematično, jer jedini način na koji imamo da onda da razumemo, da shvatimo da li lek deluje ili ne, jeste na tome što je zasnovano u logičkom pozitivizmu i jednoj simplifikovanom razmišljanju o tome šta su dijagnoze. I ovakav pristup upravo vodi do toga da mi ne znamo suštinski, dakle, da li mi kažemo, na primjer, imate kategoriju antidepresiva i studije pokazuju da su takozvani SSRI-zeri jednaki. Ako mi imamo njih 6, 4 koje se koriste u Srbiji svakodnevno velikim, kažem, količinama, mi kažemo na osnovu studija, mi tvrdimo da su oni jednake efikasnosti. Ako imate depresiju, sve jedno koju uzmete. Ali isto tako imamo da ljudi u 30% slučajeva imaju terapijski odgovor na prvi SSRI-zer, ako ga samo promenite, onda ćete imati još povećanje od oko 20% efikasnosti. Znači, gledamo da tu stvari ne funkcionišu baš kako treba. Da se vratimo sada, znači da pređemo sada na drugi deo, i to je taj čin interpretacije kao ono što je kao konstitutivni u razvoju simptoma uopšte. Ovo se naslanja na Gadamerovu hermeneutiku i ovde što želim da kažem jeste da takozvani razvoj simptoma, odnosno šta mi koncipiramo kao recimo depresivno raspoloženje, jeste dinamično i pod uticajem je interpersonalno, odnosno zato što mi ne postojimo kao nekakvi izolovan subjekat koji ima nekakvu granicu čvrstu prema spoljašnjoj sredini, nego smo sve vreme uključeni u tu sredinu i ta sredina je takođe konstitutivna za samo naše biće, ajde da kažemo u najširem mogućem smislu, tako da i simptom koji onda nastaje mora da nastaje u toj dimenziji, da se menja u odnosu između onoga što je spoljna sredina, odnosno prosvega druga osoba ili, ajde da kažemo, i kultura uopšte i ono što jeste subjekat. I, međutim, čovjek kada doživljava nešto, on izveštava o subjektivnom, onome što je tako u prvom licu. I čovjek može da kaže, na primjer, obasjalo me crno sunce, osjećam se kao da sam zavijen nekakvim omotom, da mi ništa ne omogućava da iskoračim napred, ne vidim budućnost. To su sad sve nekako doživljaji koji su inače i vrlo teški za artikulisanje, ali koje pacijent, odnosno subjekat koji pati, pokušava da prenese. Međutim, ono što drugo lice radi, u ovom slučaju kliničar, jeste da interpretira to prema objektivizirajućem i u principu medikalizovanom jednom okviru i koji onda može da kaže pa da, to je depresivno raspoloženje ili slično i ne samo da je to onda da se to dešava, već i sam subjekat koji pati takođe preuzima tu koncepciju i kaže da, to jeste, znači svi ti moji doživljaji jesu deo depresivnog raspoloženja ili anhedonije ili bilo čega sličnog. I to je takozvana core perspektiva koju opet žao mi je što ovdje nema vremena da to sada mnogo detaljnije pojašnjava, ali znači usmerava se kliničar ili treće lice na aspekte tela koje može da observira ili iskustvo koje je nekako merljivo. Jer je vrlo teško koncipirati kao treće lice šta znači obasjalo me crno sunce. Znači potrebno je nekako da to se objektivizuje. I dakle, uvek postoji ta tenzija između onoga što je treće lice ili interpretativni čin i onoga što je prvo lice i mislim da u velikoj meri ono što predstavlja simptom podrazumeva tu dinamiku između subjekta i između trećeg lica, da se onda u tom interpersonalnom razvije ono što je što mi vidimo kao nekakav simptom. To se čak slično nešto tome postoji kod Sartre koji govori o telu za mene s jedne strane i o telu za drugog, pošto to nije ista stvar. Priroda razvoja leka zasnovana je baš na perspektivi iz trećeg lica i mislim da do sada barem nije doticala to spoznaju šta je to subjektivno, kako bi delovalo to što je subjektivno i onda mi imamo i preporuke, koje se zasnivaju Znači, kako treba lečiti depresiju, zasnivaju se na ovoj koncepciji koju sam do sada izložio, dakle, na objektivizirajućem jednom načinu. I vi sada radite, moram da kažem, i protiv opšteg standarda psihijatrije, ukoliko biste vi rekli imam određenu koncepciju da ovaj pacijent ima promenu u svom subjektivitetu kome bi odgovarao ovaj lek koji možda nije prva linija, ali to na osnovu intuicije, kliničkog iskustva i slično. Dakle, tu postoji problem jer takođe i društvo, zato što funkcioniše na ovom, odnosno stručna praksa, funkcioniše po ovim principima objektivizacije, onda vas prisiljavaju da ne radite prema, znači da se ne usmeravate na ono što su subjektivne izmene u okviru mentalnih poremećaja. Kako sad taj problem da zaobiđemo? Mi moramo da pomirimo tu tenziju između trećeg lica i prvog lica. Mislim da to jedino možemo da pomirimo, možda ne jedino, ali da najbolje što je meni do sada poznato jeste kroz pojam koji potiče iz fenomenologije, a to je utelovljenost. Dakle, telo je istovremeno objektivno kao fizičko telo i kao tako je ono predmet medicine, dakle kardiologa koji leči sistem organa kao srce, ali isto tako je i doživljeno, odnosno mi ne postojimo mimo svog tela, već postojimo, kao što je čuveno Merleau-Ponty o tome pričao, nemamo telo, mi jesmo telo. I ono oblikuje uopšte totalitet našeg iskustva, mi ne postojimo mimo njega i onaj neodvojivi deo onoga što mi jesmo. I svaka intervencija koja se tiče objektivnog tela mora da uključe razumevanje toga što je utelovljenost, odnosno onoga što je subjektivitet. I dakle, postoji taj jedinstvo doživljenog tela i fizičkog tela po Fuchsu i Lee, ili proživljeni korpor, odnosno i objektivno. I iz perspektive utelovljenosti i šire 4 kognicije i enaktivizma, onda problem kako ja delujem lekom ili kad uzmem lek, kako delujem na moj to nije onda više problem između uma i tela, nego predstavlja zaobilazi se u jednom smislu i postaje problem tela. Znači, to dva aspekta iste celine. Kako to sad ponovo da povežemo sa lekovima? Dakle, psihofarmaci deluju na, to je tvrdnja, na celinu onoga što je utelovljeno biće i gde nam to pomaže u krajnje pragmatičnom i praktičnom smislu. Znači, poznato je da antidepresivi, SSRI-ze, Prozac, čuveni, što je fluoksetin, sertralin i tako, znači lekovi koji su stvarno u praksi u velikoj meri, mi kažemo oni mogu da deluju neželjen, njihov efekt jeste emocionalna zaravljenost. Zato što smo to ispitali u randomizovanim kontrolisanim studijama, međutim tu mislim da gubimo jedan segment razumevanja zato što je pitanje da li to zaista može jednostavno tako prosto se percipira kao emocionalna zaravljenost, neželjen efekt, možda je to i vrsta, jedan deo željenog efekta, ako mi razumemo to kroz taj subjektivitet na koji deluje. Znači možda jeste to je dublja transformacija po ovom mišljenju utelovljenog uma, a ne samo prosto nekako zaranjivanje. Isto tako, antipsihotici, opšte poznato da oni deluju na dopaminergičke sisteme, svi sada poznati su trenutno koji su se pokazali da dovode do kontrole bolesti ili izmučenja, deluju na dopaminergičku transmisiju. Mi kažemo onda imate efekt ili potiskivanja psihoze, sumane halucinacije i slično, a onda imate s druge strane ekstrapiramidni sindrom kao neželjeni efekt. To znači da pošto dopamin je takođe implikovan u pokretanju, onda da imamo i situaciju u kojoj dopamin, znači imamo ekstrapiramidni sindrom ili nešto što deluje na psihozu, međutim, da opet zaobilazimo i potpuno smo slepi, mislim, za ova razmišljanja da zapravo to ima veze i sa promenama u prostornoj percepciji, u izmenama intenziteta čulnog doživljaja, znači u orijentaciji uopšte u svetu, u jednom širem smislu, a ne samo u potiskivanju psihoze s jedne strane i u neželjenim efektima kočenja, pod znacima navoda s druge strane. Dakle, telesne promene nisu samo neželjeni efekti, već i izrazi preoblikovane subjektivnosti usled dejstva psihofarmaka, izmene tela kao doživljeno. Kratko, opet osvrnut ću se na način kako onda deluje. Znači, ipak moramo da imamo nekakav model objašnjavanja i mislim da je jedan zadovoljavajući koji potiče od Thomasa Fuchsa, koji kaže da postoji nešto što on to naziva kružna uzročnost. Dakle, ako deluje na telo i u subjektivnom smislu, postoje ose, to su fiktivne naravno stvari, mi samo pomogli sebi da koncipiramo, koje se odnose takozvana vertikalna osa unutar organizma ili deo celina, dakle molekul, receptor, ćelija, sistem tkiva, pa sve do šireg smisla i horizontalno organizam sredina, ali organizam sredina može funkcionisati na svakom od ovih pomenutih nivoa. I da ono kako lek deluje jeste kroz recipročne odnose, znači istovremeno i kroz vertikalnu sferu i kroz horizontalnu sferu, tako da to zajedno čini jednu spiralu. I dakle, organizam, onda razmišljamo o njemu kroz hijerarhiju nivoa, pri čemu najviši vertikalni nivo organizam kao celina, dok niži nivoi obuhvataju još organe, ćelije, pa čak i atome. I tu onda dolazimo do toga da postoji vertikalna kauzalnost, nispodno top-down i kauzalnost uzročnog koja ima strukturirajući uticaj, ali i uspodno. To naravno je kompatibilno sa raznim drugim teorijama prediktivnog procesiranja, enzimskih pristupa i tamo slično, ali to naravno nećemo da razrađujemo. I emocionalno stanje, poput straha, to je opet naglašavam simplistički malo rečeno, može da se farmakološki modulira promenama u metabolizmu neurotransmitera u redu, od ozdo nagore, ali isto tako i psihoterapijom promena koja dolazi, promena ličnosti, odnosa prema situaciji, to je takođe vertikalna kauzalnost, od ozgo naniže. Dakle, i horizontalna i vertikalna. A horizontalno funkcioniše na tom jednom nivou, umesto između različitih nivoa i podrazumeva takođe ono može biti unutar organizma i odnos između ćelija i između različitih organa, ali isto tako između organizma i okruženja. Pošto ističe vreme, evo, odlično. Dakle, farmakološki agensi, to je ono što tvrdim, vi ste ranije imali objašnjenje, dakle, antipsihotik deluje na dopaminergički receptori sa manje ili više poznatim mehanizmima, potiskuje psihozu, a ovde zapravo to dejstvo na mozak, iako naglašavam psihijatrijski poremeći i mentalni poremeći nisu bolesti mozga, nego su poremećaji, ajde to možemo da kažemo, to je malo isto, ali mislim da su problemi subjektiviteta, znači ovo nam pruža, mislim, drugačiju dimenziju razmišljanja o tome kako lek deluje. Mozak je komponenta vertikalne ose tog kružnog sistema, kružne uzročnosti koja funkcioniše kao posrednik unutar celovitog sistema koji je utelovljen, znači ne postoji negde izvan, tako nekako sa strane. I dakle, naglašavam tu neraskidivu vezu između pojedinca, njegovog okruženja prilikom razumevanja sveobuhvatnog uticaja psihofarmakologije. Dakle, antipsihotik ne menja on nekako unutrašnje stanje kao psihoza koji je deo nekakvog zatvorenog sistema koji čini bolest, već mislim da u slučaju terapijskog uspeha, globalno rečeno, naprotiv, baš omogućavaju, da kažem, tu neku facilitaciju između onoga što je subjekat i spoljna sredina. I da ne bude zabune, istovremeno, znači ja govorim o pozitivnim nekakvim efektima psihijatrijskih psihofarmakoterapije, odnosno psihijatrijskih lekova, ali isto tako oni mogu da obstruiraju, to što bismo nazvali, možda ćemo čuti to sutra ili kasnije o tome šta je zapravo mentalno poremećaj, da on učestvuje i u društvenoj jednoj komponenti, ali znači lek sasvim sigurno može da obstruira to naše uključivanje u sredinu, ali ovdje se ja pre svega osvrćam zato što, vidite, isto tako smatram da je vrlo lako kritikovati i biti kritičan prema farmakoterapiji i zauzimati određenu poziciju u kojoj je to pokušaj kontrole, jel? I mislim, imamo čuveno to decenijama, jel? Pokušaj kontrole što se ne uklapa, mi gledamo da stavimo u zatvor ili u psihijatrijske ustanove i najlakše je to kritikovati kroz prizmu farmakoterapije, ali znači verujem da sasvim identično to važi za psihoterapiju, koju opet imate slučaj da se preporučuje toliko široko, ali ne da u vidu mentalne higijene, da svakom od nas je potrebno da se smanji distres ili kako god to koncipiramo i da je to nešto što je pozitivno. Po toj liniji logici mogli bismo lepo da koristimo kroz paradigmu poboljšavanja našeg funkcionisanja u svakodnevnom svetu. Ali nama je to nekako, pali nam se neka lampica moralne osude, a ne pali nam se kada je pitanje farmakoterapija. Dakle, ja sad iz ovog fenomenološkog stanovišta smatram da je jednak. Dakle, ako osuđujemo jedno po većini argumenta, mislim, tu postoje drugi argumenti, možete da kažete u psihoterapiji čovjek mora da učestvuje, a u farmakoterapiji ne, ali isto mislim da to nije sasvim tačno. U svakom slučaju, evo, jedan od jednostavnijih primjera, ajde, kako ta kružna uzročnost funkcioniše. Dakle, mi kažemo neuroplastično, sad da znamo da je to ključni mehanizam dejstva, kako, na primjer, i psihodelici deluju i antidepresivi, dakle, kao potkuću za nekakve veze između unutar mozga, a zapravo mnogo mislim da je bolje razumeti to kroz mrežu isprepletane vertikalne i horizontalne uzročenosti. Šta bi to bila horizontalna osa, opet u najširem mogućem smislu, pospešivanje medijacije između nervnog tkiva i stimulusa iz sredine, ali isto tako prekidanje neadaptivnih obrazaca i pospešivanje fleksibilnije uključivanja u odnose sa drugim ljudima. Kada to jeste slučaj. Antidepresiv kada se daje, ako je indikovan adekvatno i slično, kada se povlači depresija, ona omogućava da se isto ponašanje, izbjegavanja, povlačenja, da se ljudi lakše i bolje uključuju u ono što bismo smatrali da je nekakav zdrav ili, kako je rekao kolega ranije, dobar život. Tako da time omogućava individu i da iznova rekonceptualizuje svoje proživljeno iskustvo. A šta se dešava u vertikalnoj osi? Znači, mirimo onda situaciju i tu kažemo moguće da se reorganizuje i samo tkivo na nivou sinapse, posredovane takozvanim BDNF-om ili Brain Derived Neurotrophic Factor. Znači, tu imamo interakciju između proteina i tkiva i između neurona i nervnog kola. Znači, istovremeno horizontalnu i vertikalnu osu i da ta neuroplastičnost uspostavlja povratnu spregu između vertikalnih bioloških promjena i horizontalnih iskustvenih pomaka i to je jedini način na koji mi možemo, mislim, da smisleno razumemo lekove. Vrlo kratko, samo ću reći nešto, znači šta onda mi treba da radimo, kako sad ovo da dovedemo u kliničku praksu. Mislim da je neophodno da istražimo efekte utelovljenosti psihofarmaka i da pravimo, da mapiramo. Kao što sam, ovaj primjer koji sam dao da escitalopram i sertralin, znači dva SSRI-zera, kod jednog će jedan da deluje, kod drugog će drugi, mi smatramo da imaju praktično vrlo sličan ili isti mehanizam dejstva, ali očito da nemaju iste efekte na subjektivitet, iz razloga koji su nama u ovom trenutku nepoznati. Na kraju se to svodi, ko praktičari dobro znaju, na intuiciju, pomoćete kako da date koji prvi, na primjer, SSRI. Znači, na priliku kako vama, verovatno se hvatao taj nekakav geštalt koji je verovatno negde ispod uobičajenog nivoa svesti i na osnovu toga, jer to je to čuveno kliničko iskustvo. I to je započeto u oblasti psihodelika, to trasiranje kako se deluje na subjektivitet, ali i to, evo, na primjer, promjena u strukturi svesti, u afektivitetu, u telidanosti, temporalnosti, doživlje prostornosti. I sad mi, hoću da ukažem na to da je neophodno da proširimo ove pristupe psihotropne lekove koje se svakodnevno koriste da bismo utvrdili podjednako osobne primjene promjene u iskustvu izvan biohemijskih efekata. I to sve ima za cilj, znači, propagiranje jednog humanističkog principa, jer ono što i jeste suština nije samo zato što smatramo da je fenomenološka teorija dobra teorija koja objašnjava ovo, nego zato što uvažavamo cijelinu, iskustvo pacijenta, osobe koje u patnji i da omogućimo sveobuhvatnije razumevanje njegovog stanja. Ukratko, dakle, za kraj, usvajanje utelovljenog u širom smislu fenomenološkog pristupa psihofarmakologije omogućava sveobuhvatnije razumevanje utjecaja psihofarmaka ne samo na simptome, već i na doživljeno, proživljeno, kako god se to prevede, iskustvo pacijenta, kružna kauzalnost, vertikalno-horizontalnog odnosa, mislim da pruža zadovoljavajući trenutno model koji treba da se razvija, ali za razumevanje delovanja psihofarmaka u širem smislu, a ne samo kroz biologizirajući princip i dalje razvoj ovog cijelog polja mogu da uključi izradu detaljnih fenomenoloških profila različitih psihofarmaka koji bi pospešili individualizovan pristup lečenju. I samo ću reći još nešto. Dakle, isto krajnje logično zašto se na ovaj način biološki lekovi razvijaju. Dakle, regulatorna tela koja su američki FDA, kod nas postoji Evropska medicinska agencija, su oni koji odlučuju da li će se lek registrovati i koristiti ili ne. Oni zahtevaju uobičajeno 2 randomizovane kontrolisane studije i opšte je poznato da je razvoj lekova svih onkoloških, psihijatrijskih, kardioloških izuzetno skup. I vi sada ako hoćete da odskočite od onoga što je standard, a taj kapitalistički način, nažalost, jeste ono što pruža tu silu kako znači uopšte istraživanja lekova funkcionišu, nema interes da odudara od onoga što će omogućiti najbrži put registracije novog leka i, nažalost, profitu. Ovo je nešto malo drugačije, ali mislim da vredi o tome razmišljati i tako sve, da pokušati s ovo sve, da na pacijentima presveti. Hvala vam na pažnji.
Hvala, Stefane. Otvaramo pitanje.
Hvala puno na izlaganju. Samo par pitanja. Na neki način imamo ova dijalektika između tipove i primjer. Onda na neki način možemo reći, ok, imamo neke klasifikacije koje ne trebamo reificirati, samo trebamo onda specifično gledati kako je iskustvo pacijent, to je važno u ovom slučaju i predstaviti iz perspektive farmakologe. Samo sam želio pitati, imate neke preporuka, mislite da DSM, na primjer, bi se mogli obogatiti koristeći ovu perspektivu? Da, vi ste spomenuli pozitivizam, da, ove kategorije najviše su behavioralne, ali ima inferencija na nekom mentalnom stanju. Onda vi mislite da možda bi mogli imati neka vrsta DSM koji može razlikovati subkategorije, subpopulacije. Onda imamo depresiju, onda imamo različite populacije s perspektive življenja, iskustva. Imate neke preporuke ili mislite da bi se trebalo potpuno nemati nešto kao DSM i ići direktno subjektivno?
To je obično pitanje i mislim da što se tiče DSM-a i MPD-a nije slučajno naravno zašto oni postoje u tom obliku. Mislim da jesu potrebni, zato što pre svega oni su zasnovani 80. godine, znači da bi taj DSM-3 prebacio se na takozvano deskriptivno, znači opis nekakvog iskustva, to je, ali to je jednostavno opis, znači to je našao. Znači to je nastalo zbog toga što je postalo očito da se ne mogu usaglasiti na čuvena studija između američkih psihijatara i psihijatara iz Velike Britanije koji su iste pacijente pregledali, odnosno gledali njihove kliničke manifestacije koji su dolazili do potpuno različitih dijagnoza, pre svega da li jeste ili nije schizofrenija, da što bismo rekli, pa bar što se toga tiče mi imamo nekakav razumevanje. I ono što smo dobili primjenom tih dijagnostičkih kriterijuma na kojima se zasnovao DSM-3, a i praktično DSM-5 i MPD-11, jeste da se ta usaglašenost poboljšala, ali ono što je problem jeste to što ste rekli, reifikacija, dijagnostički literalizam, to je bilo, mislim da to ima i istorijski značaj i kontekst, zato što to je bilo 80. godine, sada je prošlo gotovo 50 godina od tada. I generacije ljudi su stasale na toj koncepciji depresija jeste loše raspoloženje, znači nekoliko kriterijuma i da se to izdiže na nekakav, znači nekako sad to je ono što depresija jeste i da smo tu izgubili sve ono, pred dijagnostičkih kriterijuma bilo je očigledno da postoje pojave koje nalikuju ovome, jel to se zove melanholija, mada je to očigledno i to nije nešto kao što je depresija. Tako da jeste potrebno, ali znači, s druge strane, zanemaruje i negira subjektivno iskustvo. Ja mislim da značaj toga treba da se smanji, da regulatorna tela ne donose odluke o tome koju farmakološku intervenciju ćemo primenjivati isključivo na tim kategorijama. A da li treba da postoje subkategorije, to je takođe, mislim, očigledno. Mi smo ranije imali podele u okviru depresije na razne stanje, pa na melanholičnu depresiju, imali smo na takozvanu endogenu ili egzogenu depresiju, da li je težište treba staviti na nešto s polja ili na ono iznutra. Studije su nam pokazale da to i ne postoji baš nekakva razlika, ali onda reći da cijela ta koncepcija je pogrešna i da je zanemarimo i sva istraživanja i nauka se razvija na osnovu ovoga što je sada, mislim da to nije dobro i da je to upravo razlog zašto imamo i konfuziju donekle u trenutnoj nauci, kada su pitanje mentalni poremeći, šta funkcioniše, šta ne funkcioniše, šta pogoršava, šta ne. Izlično, zato što jednostavno ono što ispunjava kriterijuma koja depresija može biti sasvim drugačije subjektivno doživljeno nego što je nešto drugo.
Još ti. Hoćete vi prvo?
Pokušat ću da onda što kraće formulišem. Prvo, ohrabrujuće je, zahvaljujem se, čuti psihijatra koji je toliko spreman da se udubi u fenomenološki svet svog klijenta ili pacijenta. Na primjeru depresije. Prvo, ne čini da li je ispravna konstatacija koja se može naći, a to je više nije naučna literatura, već kako bih rekao, prodrelo u svakodnevne medijume, da se lekovi, uzmemo primjer depresije, da se razvijaju na osnovu toga što svaka sledeća generacija ima manje odgradnih dejstava, počeo od inhibitora, monoamine oksidaze do ovih SNE i danas. A čini mi se da vi preporuke dobre prakse dobijate upravo na osnovu njihovih, na osnovu čega, to je moje prvo pitanje. A drugo je možda više vezano za fenomenologiju, recimo depresije. Po vašem osjećanju, po vašem uvidu kao kliničara, u kom momentu, vi ste naveli jedan srećan primjer, a to je kad recimo prvi SSRI počne da deluje 30% poveća, pa sledeći još 20%. Ali znamo da je stopa odbijanja baš tih SSRI, pa nemalo, jel? U stvari, tako piše. U kom lancu te kružne uzročnosti najčešće ljudi krenu da odbijaju, recimo, antidepresivu?
Samo da vidim da li sam dobro razumela taj drugi deo pitanja, odbijaju u smislu da odustaju zbog onoga što se koncipira kao neželjeni efekt.
Zbog bilo čega. Poželim od vas da čujem zbog čega odustaju.
Da, to mislim odlično pitanje koje je jako široko, zato što to ne mora naravno da bude neželjeni efekat usko definisan, nego i uticaj društva i ovoga o čemu sam govorio, nama je u redu da idemo na psihoterapiju, a nije nam u redu da uzmemo lek, mada onda da postoji adekvatna indikacija, upravo i pričamo da te indikacije nisu tako striktne. Mislim da svaka intervencija nosi izvesne rizike i to je činjenica, isto kao i živeti uopšte jeste rizik. Znači, to je pokušaj promene nekog sadašnjeg stanja. Po mom sadašnjeg stanja, koje je nezadovoljavajuće, koje se verovatno nalazi u nekakvom balansu. Mislim da je to slučaj kod depresije. Dakle, ipak organizam postigne neki zadovoljavajući balans, ne nestane, ne umre, ali to je ono što proizvodi ogromnu količinu patnje. Mislim da je ključno razlikovati i tu dolazimo do srži problema, jeste da li je to stanje koje je zaista kvalitativno različito od onoga što bismo smatrali da je nekakav ravan iskustva koje omogućava dobar život. I smatram da postoji kvalitativna razlika. Dakle, da nije tuga svaka depresija. I to je ono gde je zamka DSM-a i MKD-a. Dakle, depresivno raspoloženje mislim, vrlo je teško presuditi šta to podrazumeva. Ali ako se osvrnemo na druge aspekte, ako pokušavamo da, znači, artikulišemo to iskustvo ne kroz depresivno raspoloženje, nego kroz fenomenološke koncepte kao što su zatvaranje horizonta budućnosti, u jednom smislu, i mogućnosti uopšte, doživljaj da se vreme zaustavlja. Naravno, intelektualno ja znam da se ono ne zaustavlja, ali moj osjećaj iznutra jeste unutar depresije, bar smatram da to sam viđao, da se zaustavlja. Da su to ključne stvari koje nas opredeljuju da onda postoji kvalitativna razlika i da u tom slučaju treba lečiti. To lečenje će možda dođe i sa nekim rizicima, neželjenim efektima, poznata je seksualna disfunkcija, to emocionalno zarobljivanje i tako dalje, ali mislim da ćemo onda čak i u manjem riziku biti od tih neželjenih efekata, nego ako smo to primenili na nešto što bi bilo žalovanje nakon nekog gubitka koje nema taj kvalitet, jer to je najbliže što mogu da kažem. Mislim da bilo šta što je preskriptivno, što bi rekao, ovo jeste depresija, ovo sigurno nije, da je to problematično i da ne treba upadati u tu zamku. I samo kratko vam govorim na ovo prvo pitanje, znači kako mi odlučujemo, to je regulatorna tela odobre određeni lek. I vi kliničku praksu ne sprovodite adekvatno ako vi ispunjava indikacije i ne primenite lek koji se smatra da je prve linije prema autoritativnim preporukama. A upravo cijelo ovo predavanje govori o tome da te preporuke su zasnovane na jednom odnosu koje je problematično i ne treba ga uzimati kao čvrstu istinu.
Onda, gde postavljaš ono što sada postoji kao instinkt farmakokliničara, na primjer, ja dajem seroksat samo sredovečnim ženama, tako nešto što ste čuti da ljudi govore. Gde je to što znači nije zasnovano na strukturisanom nekom fenomenološkom ili nečemu što se javilo u praksi? Gde to postavljaš u sistem cirkularne pouzdanosti?
Da, vrlo zahtevno pitanje. Prvo, mislim da bilo kakav pristup koji omogućava da mi široko čoveku koji je bezimen, to je pitanje bez imena, da ja nisam subjekat koji postoji, nego ispunjavam neke karakteristike opšte je potpuno pogrešan. Znači da tu nema dalje razgovora o bilo kakvoj i da je to jednostavno loša praksa. Bez poštovanja individualnosti nema. E sad, ako s druge strane govorimo o tome da od pacijenta koji ispunjava određene karakteristike tog subjekta ja imam nekakav doživljaj da će pomoći lek, da ono što sam govorio o Gadamerovoj hermeneutici i interpretativnom razvoju simptoma, da u stvari u tom odnosu mi dolazimo između kliničara i pacijenta, mi dolazimo do nekog razumevanja, znači do te fenomenološke dimenzije u odnosu na koju mi možemo da izvršimo intervenciju. To je malo opšti odgovor, ali čini mi se da je to ono što jedino moguće, jer bilo šta što bi bilo u ovom slučaju raditi tako što jesu zvanične smjernice, u slučaju ispunjavanja indikacija primijeniti ovu intervenciju, nije u suštini put u pomaganje ljudima u punom obimu onoga što podrazumeva lečenje.
Stefane, hi Lois, can you hear us? You are muted.
Sorry, hello, yes, perfectly. I've been listening.
Okay, Stefan was a bit too long, but we don't mind, and I hope you do not mind also. So I will introduce our next keynote speaker, and this is Dr. Luis Madeira from the University of Lisbon. He is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, but also holds a doctoral degree in philosophy and psychiatry. So he works at the University of Lisbon in Portugal, but also in hospitals as a psychiatrist. You will add anything that you think is also relevant for where you work right now. I'm not sure about the details, but Dr. Luis Madeira will be talking today about mediocrity and contemporary mind, the weight and collapse of autonomy. So let's have a listen.
So, can you hear me well?
Yes, and you can also share your presentation.
I will. Just thanking you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and honor to join you. This is a topic which is very dear to me, and hopefully I can bring you insights about this. I've been recently in Timișoara, not that far from Serbia, speaking about this. And so I'll just share my screen for you to see me. I'll share my desktop. You can see my slides, isn't it? Okay, so I'll start out by saying that this is a topic very dear to me. I've been researching on it for a while. I've just submitted a paper on it, and hopefully I can just bring about everything that I want to speak in the 30 minutes I have to speak. So why should we speak about mediocrity? And for me, there's a personal reason for that. So for me, it's very hard. It's a very violent experience and it was very hard for me to explain to colleagues and friends the difference between what I feel when I'm facing something that is mediocre from what is bad or wrong. And it's also very much a feeling that contemporary life forces us to a form of mediocrity. And I felt it was an ethical necessity to find solutions. And in the time that we live, mediocrity has become a collective atmosphere. There's a systemic softening of distinction, a neutralization of ethical intensity, and it has become a saturated cultural condition. I think that it permeates every interaction, our institutions, and our value systems. And therefore, it's not a superficial cultural amend that we cannot speak about to each other, but something very much dense and part of society. Lastly, for a medical profession, I think it's very important because as a psychiatrist, I think the atmospheres that we find in our patients resonate with mediocrity because many of these experiences that I'll be speaking about are very close to burnout, depression, anxiety, anhedonia. And I think that training in psychiatry by trainees, residents, and full psychiatrists really need to access this content because without it, we risk not being able to recognize the pressures we have in our everyday life about it. So I'll just give you a brief historical primer. So mediocrity was not a negative thing. In the past, it was a positive thing. To be mediocre would be in the middle rank. And in the Christian religion, it would manifest as temperance, humility, and industriousness. It was only later that it was transposed to the values under capitalism, and it has undergone profound semantic shift. Right now, the use of the word mediocre is something very pejorative. It has transformed the way we see what is to be in the middle. In the 20th century, it became a central concern. The word that people, philosophers and literate people used was not mediocre, was middlebrow. And they were facing very vague and unsatisfactory definitions. So they found that there was a problem about these definitions. And there is said that in the beginning of the last century, there was the age of the mediocre. So the age where there was a great supply of mediocre brains that greatly exceeds the demand. And we have many authors. I just bring you Virginia Woolf, Lewis, and Clement. Lewis said that people that were mediocre, they betrayed both the rigor that elites would require, but also the authenticity of folk, of everyday folk people, as if they were commodifying life for mass consumption, stripping out the depth and critique. Greenberg also criticized it, said that it was not an accidental act of taste. He said that it was a necessary product of a capitalistic culture in the bourgeoisie. And Virginia Woolf, added a layer which for me is very interesting, that to be mediocre is to be unable to choose, to be averse to risk and discomfort, and to not be able to find an aesthetic judgment. And in the late 20th century, we see other drivers for mediocrity, not just the loss of choice, but the fact that we are too much exposed to things. So people become mediocre not because they are deprived of knowledge, but because they are saturated of knowledge. And this saturation creates a feeling that of every desire can be anticipated, commodified, and circulated. And we see this in his idea of a greenhouse world in which individuals are offered everything, so they are overprotected and under-challenged. And they feel anxious, but also passive and existential vacued. And I would say that mediocrity is a structural disposition. And we all, I would say myself too, find moments where I feel between boredom and docility, comfort and exhaustion, and it shapes the way we know, feel, and act. And there are many philosophers delving into this concept, which for me are relevant to bring about. I'll bring them very lightly because it's very difficult to bring their depthness. Nietzsche is one of the most relevant ones, and his definition of resentment, how people that were not noble inverted the noble virtues into reactive compensations. So for Nietzsche, mediocrity was not an accident, but a cultural triumph, the leveling of affective intensities and the suppression of a tragic grandeur. And therefore, people would stop fighting for things which are relevant by devaluing the values and resenting anyone else who was excellent. So this idea that the principle of social cohesion was just the possibility of conforming to anything that is common and not having anything exceptional happening. Emile Cioran also wrote a lot about this. He wrote a lot of ironic and sarcastic ideas, but I like this one very much. There are people so stupid that if an idea appeared to the surface of their brain, it would commit suicide, terrified of loneliness. So this idea that there's a lot of people who do not allow themselves to create ideas in their mind. And he said two things which for me are very interesting. One of this idea of choice of metaphysical exile, which is that I retrieve myself to a form of spiritual anemia, the tepid incapacity to burn with intensity, and I will not generate or dwell in the vital world. I just remove myself from the world, and critique leads to fatigue, and despair replaces desire. Derrida wrote about the concept of différance, and he said that if mediocrity was the opposite of that, so it was the feeling of a person to decide not to exist, to be exactly what she is expected about. And this idea that the mediocrity of the ontology of the mediocrity must thus be an ontology. And he has this idea that we need to explore how difference is lost and how we try to defer meaning and essence of things. So we are only creating a simulacrum of presence in the contemporary world. As I spoke before, the greenhouse world is a very interesting idea. This idea we all live in a form of excess with comfort, stimulation, and pseudo-creativity. And so we inflated banality of our everyday lives. We see it in Instagram and Facebook into a show. So mediocrity takes the monstrous aesthetic, hyperbolic state of being. Most people, they publish in their social networks everything they are doing hyperbolically, but it is only performative because it has no depth. So Sloterdijk writes, which for me is very interesting, is like the substrate of contemporary has become a spectacle. Everything is played in a loop of automated gestures devoid of reflexivity. Baudrillard adds the layer of simulacra, the idea that reality we inhabit has become a simulacra. Science became autonomous, creating a feeling of hyperreality where authenticity is impossible. This idea that in late capitalism, we have low-grade affects and we feel that we have a lot of surfaces, but no substance in what we are doing. Byung-Hun Han, it's very difficult to pronounce his name, but he said that also in the contemporary life, there is a collapse of excess and repetition. Like the subject is so overdriven, overexposed, and hyper-responsible, and is feeling the neoliberal imperative to do things that he collapses into anxiety, fatigue, and digital self-display. So this loop, endless feedback loop, leads the subject to become mediocre, not because he doesn't act, but he is compelled to act continuously without pause and contemplation. So there's this repetition, algorithmic repetition and hollow novelty of everyone that's living in the world. And this has become not only a topic for philosophy, but also for social and cultural studies. And we see, first of all, that culture has been disrupted. This idea that we stop seeing culture as a site of distinction, but a site, and now as a site of simulation and mediation rather than generation. So we usually manage and perform rather than critically change what we live. We are always performing something in our lives. We find as a cultural value neutrality, so usually institutions value neutrality, that someone that refuses and abstains for taking a position in a debate, that remains outside of conflict, that is indecisive in nuances and lacks brilliance. So the lack of individuality is something very keen on a value of contemporary life. So choosing only what was chosen for us is most of what we do. And Virginia Woolf writes, when I find very beautiful, there is nothing worse than Queen Anne furniture that is faked but expensive, first editions of dead writers. For her, it is always the worst. Pictures or reproductions of pictures by dead painters. So the idea that a person would choose something that someone else chose as important and relevant, because for her, to buy living art, something that no one has told us that is bad, requires living taste. And the media has imposed a lot of needs of mediocrity. We see rewarding people that follow trends, this idea to refuse and transgress the horizons of thought and style. So taste became a way to signal someone's social position. And rituals circulated through the media became naturalized through repetition and disarming possibilities of critique. Class has also determined pressures for mediocrity. The fact that we live in a precarious world with structural uncertainty of the world leads us to feel that we are just managers. We perform labor coded as if it was authentic, but it is indeed just no recognitions, and most people do not feel any vocation in what they do. Diversity also, we have a lot written about women and racialized communities such as LGBT also. They try to be effectively legible. They limited their ability to deviate from normative emotional content. And there's a lot written on this also. And for me, most striking is also there are institutional demands for mediocrity. I would say that schools and pedagogy has been adapted to it in contemporary life. They reward correct repetition and ignore deep understanding. Our working environments are very visible for this. And there's also management that feels that they are always performing instead of exploring or disrupting interventions in their life. Universities are definitely places where infrastructures maintain mediocrity because they enforce play, smooth continuity, and evacuating space for any sort of rupture or ethical ambition. And if I say universities, I also say academia, because I believe that in academia we exist at the lowest stage of existence if we see the way we publish and we are precious to publish. So we reiterate and validate productivity and self-optimization, ignoring any form of emotional engagement. So to survive in academia, we need to find metricized ways of existing, relinquishing any individual life goals. And I believe that excellence is only formally valued. It's structurally disincentivized. I'll just now discuss a bit about the phenomenology of it, or what it's like to experience the mediocrity. One of the first experience is very close to depression, which is profound boredom, tedium to a sense of destruction. It's not a tedium that doesn't come because you're not stimulated, because you're left in a void, but a tedium because excess of stimulation. The time becomes heavy, the self is suspending, and there's the collapse of the effective investment that we have. We find the quiet implosion of our symbolic world. There's loss of existential necessity. Objects and gestures become disjointed and absurd. Temporal dimension is also disrupted. There's this sense that we are attenuated in our capacity to project into the future. It's very akin to depression, this sense of nothing can take us out of this present. But while in depression, there is this sense of stop. In a mediocrity, there's no pause. There's a continuous loop of non-happening. So it leads the subject to a frenetic standstill and burnout. Indeed, in mediocrity, we could say that chronos reigns at the cost of kairos. There is no opportunity, no transformation. The person is always busy, struck in repetitive cycles of productivity and self-maintenance. And there's no anchoring to the world. One of the things we find in contemporary life is the loss of ritual, which in the past guarded cultural density and now has been replaced by circulation. There's the loss of transmission of values. So this idea that we without ritual, we cannot find ways to transform values. We just transfer stimuli. Another thing which is for me very interesting for mediocrity is this idea of lateral agency. This idea that I'm living my life in plan B, it's not my plan A. So that I live in a mode of endurance, avoiding any form of transformation. And the mediocre subject is not heroic or resistance, but adaptive and buffered, with low-level anxiety, ironic detachment, and affective desaturation. There's this loss of the thickness of experience. The mediocrity life is filled with signs, gestures, and content, but there's no thickness to those gestures. We feel that we are performing rather than really living our life. And Sian Nagai wrote a very interesting paper on minor affects, and she describes as ugly feelings also. But we in contemporary life, we have a lot of these moods that have meaning, but no substance. It's very interesting. It's like we can say them, but we don't feel them. And in a sense, I have a few of my patients who come from America. They usually say, that's hilarious when I say something funny, but they do not feel the funniness in what I'm saying, as if we have replaced the feeling itself by a description of the feeling in our relational life. And these ugly feelings are very common in contemporary life: irritation, envy, boredom. And they arise not from oppression, because in the past we have a lot of systems, most of them fascist or communist, that oppressed the subject. But right now, the subject feels these feelings not by oppression, but by saturation and impotence. There's this sense of pacifying politeness that is flat, ongoing, and hard to politize. So indeed, we cannot we cannot find directions in our structures of life experience. And it leads us to find a feeling of cynicism, or as Fowler wrote, interpassivity. Interpassivity is that we have to find what is right and wrong in others to continue on functioning, to dismiss ourselves, to become passive, and dismiss our capacity to criticize what's happening into the world. So I continue on living a life that I feel it's wrong, but I keep on living it. And what this leads is an empty saturation of sameness. I feel that individuals are saturated with knowledge, but unable to critically interpret them. So this curation, which in the digital world is even algorithmically curated, creates cognitive bubbles that prioritize ease and recognizability. Some people even say that if you speak and your phone is listening about the fact that you're angry with your mother, the phone will start, and Facebook and Instagram will start showing you things that support what you're feeling, that you recognize what you find now and you're at ease with it. It leads to a flattened epistemology where complexity is filtered out in society. And there's also these two experiences: the anxiety of not having done enough and the despair of having everything yet feeling nothing. I have everything in my life and I feel nothing. And the idea which Laurent writes, which I like a lot, of cruel optimism. I remain attached to the world. I keep on repeating my gestures, accelerated lifestyles, but I cannot flourish. I have this optimism that I feel will lead me nowhere. And so finalizing my talk is to discuss with you what are the problems for me and how can we aim at a possible ascesis, a change from this situation. So there are outer pressures towards mediocrity. I discussed about the age of weakening, where I can no longer have ideas and express my ideas, not because I am told by the regiment, a fascist or communist dictatorial regiment, but because I no longer can think because of the interpretative pluralism. I fail to exist in the world. The other pressure we find is the endlessly need for functionality. I need to be continuously functional. And even if it takes at the cost of authentic engagement and only by my mimetic adaptation. And lastly, the idea that everything is simulated, as if I don't need to be present as long as I perform in a way that people see me present. Another thing is the feeling that coercion in the contemporary world is no longer coming from the outside. People are shackled from the inside. They feel they need to continue on doing. Freedom means to do more things. I cannot stop doing things. And these inner pressures go through the regimen of overstimulation, the idea that I keep on being overstimulated, the idea of soft nihilism, this idea that I have an affective state where meaning is not negated, but rendered weightless. I don't feel meaning to be meaningful. And the idea that I exist as a non-being, as I'm being anesthetized, and this idea that I no longer feel that my morality can attach me to the world. I just fluidly go with the preference, visibility, and validation of others. And this leads the contemporary man to be mediocre in a way that he shifts from respecting himself, from self-esteem, to the dependence of social recognition. And it becomes ethically empty and leads him to feel resentment, but lacking the will to affirm life and create values he believes. So this idea that the man of contemporary life is a docile man refusing to take any existential risk. This would be the biggest problem, the idea that we live a capsular existence. We are insulated for conflict between others, mortality and encounter. And this leads the subject to become losing the capacity of ethical becoming. Just this idea that he finds that no friction is ever there, and so and everything is just soft, and I'm irritated by that. And I would say, and this is my idea, which is very interesting, is this idea that as if we are adults, but playing a serious game. We are just players and actors internalizing and reproducing self-enforced values and hierarchies under the guise of autonomy, as if we are just playing a game. But this is indeed life, and we need to change reality, and we need to go beyond the low-grade stimulation, fragmented attention, and algorithmic sociality. And this has impacted a lot of new generations. So we have destructed intergenerational transmission of symbolic authority, and there's a culture of cognitive precarity. I've been teaching ethics for the last 22 years, so I've been teaching for the last 22 years in college, and I see a big difference that people are intellectually active, but effectively flat and ethically disoriented. And individuals lack an ideal and ironically overperform in a way that for many of people I see is cynicism, and also feeling that no longer being able to see the absurdity of continuing on repeating their gestures. And if we lose the capacity to reason, is a big problem. So in the past, I would say that regiments made us unable to express opinions by the fear of reprimand and punishment. But contemporary life, we don't express opinions by the fear of hurting others or being different. And I would say that we are breeding a new generation with a loss of reasoning, which is a very problematic thing in terms of mediocrity. And I found a lot of Eastern philosophers, and in Romania there were two conferences on this. There's this loss of internal coherence, sterile suspensions of becoming, and refusal of difference. And we live in a time where even my talk to you might be useless, because knowledge is not because we don't have knowledge that we are mediocre. It is because knowledge has become too much. We cannot apply it in reality because it is severed from our existential and ethical commitment. And I think that medical curriculum needs to be changed, because students cannot be continually receiving credentials but not be transformed. And to my idea, medical humanities have a big role in this, because if not, we lead subjects to find a second form of illiteracy. And I could say that my great-grandmother that didn't study was more involved in what she thought than someone who has a lot of knowledge. Because contemporary life, we have a lot of knowledge, the capacity to operate in this knowledge, but we don't internalize or challenge this experience. And how can we break free? So such posture of taking a neutrality of being needs to be changed, because this is just a defensive existence against shame and failure, which come also as a cost of excellence. So if we really dismiss the horizons of possibility by closing ourselves and refusing to be open to exist, we dull our moral sensitivity just to live in harmony, adaptability, and polite irrelevance. So to be authentic in life does require more than just self-invention. It requires a fidelity to the depthness of our culture and no longer living in its surface. And we cannot continue on being resignated by the mediocrity we all face, because we have been gracious, most of us, we have accepted this, but we need to change this. And I believe that in academia, this is very visible, because it has become systemic and we need to resist it in any way. And the links between this and other things are very interesting, because we have to rethink what is to transmit culture. Because we have just today a shell of culture, because we are performing without inheriting any effect. So we have no anchoring to the world. And without this, we have lots of problems in life. One of the ideas that I would like to bring about is the idea of anthropotechnics. So we have to deliberately create habits in our life that cultivate possibilities of thinking about life and living an intense life. This includes ways of contemplating reality rather than analyzing reality, to relate with artistic and ritual disciplines, and re-engagement with complexity. And this also involves what? Involves slowness, silence, ritual, and so forth. It requires much more than just self-expression. It requires retraining ourselves self-transcendence. And Freire says that, and I find this very interesting, that we must start with liberation by naming. We must start naming and identifying what is mediocre in us and in others. And so this existential commitment, authenticity, and attunement is very specific. So we need to engage in activities which we find intrinsically value, take risks, embrace uncertainty, and ethically deliberate. We need to be attuned to be able to resonate in us, not by heroic gestures, but by intentionally finding our presence in the world, and again, finding a fidelity to what is depth in us. And this has links with the recovery from the world. As you can see, there's a lot of eco-anxiety in the world. We live in the age of the end of the world. So there's a lot of things that I've just discussed about recovering from mediocrity that are akin to the climate crisis we are living, because it is an environmental and symbolic crisis. We have collapsed horizons, narratives, and futures. And recovering ecologically also requires this kind of principles of slowness, reciprocity, and interdependency. So the ethical imperative is to stop being alienated and mediocre. And we find some evidence in indigenous knowledges. And it's quite interesting that we need to find a life between the consumable, performative, and spectacular. So thank you very much. I just leave you my references. I hope the paper will be published, and I'm open for questions, whatever you want.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. That was very fascinating. We open the floor for questions, so please raise your hands and ask in English first.
Do you feel that there's an aspect of the commodification of psychotherapy and maybe psychiatry that perpetuates mediocrity, or, well, how do you think that psychotherapy and psychiatry affects this pervasive atmosphere of mediocrity? And do you think that what should be done differently, or do you think that anything should be done at all?
So thank you for the question. First of all, definitely. So I think that our training, pre-graduate and postgraduate training, has become supporting mediocrity. At least in Portugal, I don't know how it is in Serbia. So I think it might be different. But every structure of our pre-graduate training in medicine, we are metricized. We find metrics for everything, and they are quantitative metrics. Even for residency, what counts is the number of patients you see rather than the quality of what you do. It counts the number of papers we see. We definitely count them, and they only count as individual, irrespective of the quality and density. We find that in academic curriculum. And so we train people to feel quantity rather than quality is what is necessary. Also, we see that also in therapy, because most of the humanistic therapies and existential therapies cannot find evidence in contemporary science, because we are mostly relying on metricized formulas in which only CBT can find evidence. So only something that is completely metricized can offer something valuable. So in the end, we find systems which are very problematic. For me, I've been a very strong critical person to our congresses. We have a lot of congresses which are very mediocre to my experience, because the prices to go to a congress are just absurd for Portuguese standards, but I know also for many of European standards. So I'm just going now to the WPA and I need to pay €1,000 to go to the congress. And the only way I can go is if a pharmaceutical industry supports me. So in the end, who goes is who the pharmaceutical industries decides. The talks we listen are talks that usually are paid for the pharmaceutical industries. The voting system for our institutions are by the number. So I'm right now the president of the Portuguese Society of Psychiatry, and I vote for Portugal in the congresses for the last 3 years because I've replaced the previous president. He was not very well. So the idea was that I replaced him, and we have less votes than any other country that has more people participating in congresses. And what determines the participation is the presence of people who are paid by the pharmaceutical industry. So this becomes, if not a big ethical problem, at least a conflict of interests that need to be discussed. And in the end, we are just performing something. We are not deeply discussing the topics. And I find teaching residency for a very long time, that is very hard for residents. There are many residents who have a cynicist approach to congresses of contemporary life because they feel they are not learning something. But I'm not sure how is the experience in Serbia. It might be different because this idea is just my feeling of the European standard.
I'd say it's pretty similar, actually. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. Thanks so much for an interesting talk. My name is Milutin Kostić. I found it funny. I had this American acquaintance, and he would say, "That's funny," with a completely blank face, and it always puzzled me. So that reminded me in your talk. I've experienced it, and it is distressing. And I found it funny how I thought that every one of us in this room, when you started talking about mediocrity, we were thinking how you're going to talk about some other people, not us. And then we started recognizing ourselves in a lot of the things you talk, and it is also distressing. Maybe we're the mediocre ones. But I wanted to ask you, I had this association of, early Christianity, but it's just one of the things. Where you see these movements where the feelings of emptiness of the current state are leading some to try to find a bigger and deeper purpose. And this leads to these major movements. And then at some point, these major movements also become mediocre, performative in themselves. And it might sound maybe a bit too harsh, but do you think that all people have the capacity for what you call, escaping mediocrity? Because I feel that a lot of times through history, it was a small group of people who were transcending it and moving things in some direction because of their feelings that this is unbearable to live this way, and others agreed, but turned it into mediocrity along the way because they really didn't maybe feel the depth that you are calling for. So what do you think about that?
Thank you. No, yeah. So one of the discussions we have is this idea that so first of all, considering the American that you were describing, one of the things I also find that I'm trying to research right now is the fact that we all text rather than just speak to each other. And when we text, we hear funny things and we just write down, "That's very funny," or we put an emoji smiling. So we are think we are distancing ourselves from our experience of an emotion to writing our emotions. And therefore, there's this distance between the emotional reaction we have and the actual expression of that emotional reaction. And that also has an impact in this distancing ourselves from that. And the other part I think you were discussing, and I think it's interesting because I also identify with a lot. So I started researching on it also with the idea that I would be researching about everyone that I don't like. And I feel that is mediocre in life, but suddenly I start identifying with a lot of things. So I think it's paradoxically a very psychotherapeutical talk, because we also have to think about what we are doing in our life. And lastly, this idea that if everyone was not mediocre, then we would just be collapsing in our system. So this idea that it's very early on in this discussion with Virginia Woolf and all the authors that wrote about it, is that society has a need of mediocre brains so that it can continue on existing. So this idea that the structure of society requires that people do not think, and this has been exploited by a lot of regiments, dictatorial regiments, because of that. And I would say that we have a duty to, as an institution, as an academic institution, and I speak about my university and my training of residents, to train people to go beyond it, because universities do not help very stupid people. So people who are very stupid, they will not improve by anything we do. And they also do not help people who are very brilliant, because whatever institution you are, you'll be brilliant wherever you are. But they do help a lot of the people that are in the mean to transcend their existence, to create changes. And usually changes, and I wrote upon this, are not by campaigning and teaching, are by experiencing. We cannot try to teach something that we do not enact in ourselves, to live existentially meaningful, to collide in what we believe, to offer others this idea that we do things we believe. So our existence, I would say, for me as a professor and for me as a doctor and as teaching residents on these topics, is to exist also like that. And as you say, probably I would not be so nihilistic to believe that there is a vast majority of people that cannot be awakened to that. There is this idea that we have three stages in life. The idea of in vino veritas, so just be drunk in life, and then waking up to reason and finding ways to escape that go through very forms of ascesis. So I think we can help people to wake up to reason, to think about what they are doing. At least I have to believe on that. But I agree with you that if you leave people to exist, the contemporary pressures will make them all become mediocre.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the extremely interesting talks. Really, I enjoyed it. I'm a philosopher. I'm Luca Malatesti. It's great. It's great to put on the table all this philosophical tradition that pushes toward a kind of more individual concerns about what is to live a life, a satisfactory life. And this can be ground for critical stance about society. So my question to you is this, give a bit also my work, because I'm trying to think a kind of minimal account of the harmfulness that should be connected to mental disorders. I'm inclined to a kind of framework where we try to allow the maximum number of possible ways of thinking what is the good life, with constraints about not harming others. So it's a kind of liberal in the philosophical tradition approach. But I was wondering, it seems that you have a kind of critical stance. So it seems that you think that the values that should be related to psychotherapy or psychiatry are more of a critical level. So in a sense, you have a kind of more, though it sounds that you're coming from this tradition of individual rationality to individual self-affirmation, but you have a kind of strong view on the values that should guide our critical stance towards society. Do you think that you are prescribing a more private type of system of values, or you think that these are really public, shareable values that can really should inspire our institutional practices, like things like DSM, or the research and so on and so forth. Because I think I really appreciate the idea that what you propose could be something that every psychotherapist should have in front of himself, thinking about, is this person in front of me someone who's thinking the new way of living, criticizing the basic assumption of society, or as the colleague was saying, is one of the person who cannot do better, so I have to help the person to adjust to the system. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. There are a few questions in this question. First of all, going into the DSM, I have a few talks about the erosion of the depthness of our diagnostic manuals. So our diagnostic manuals have attempted to remove all forms of subjectivity from diagnosis. So the DSM-1 and 2 was afflicted by many problems. There was a lot of psychoanalytical things, ideas in them, and there was a lot of attachment to content. And then there was the attempt of removing psychiatry for all subjectivity. So our diagnostic manuals of contemporary life, they are mostly a stone soup of objective symptoms. So in the past, the sheer structure of categories had a rationale between them. And right now, in our diagnostic manuals, you can attach everything. You can have bipolar with melancholic feelings. We can have depression with reverse vegetative symptoms. So major depression with reverse vegetative symptoms. While in the past, we definitely had that reverse vegetative symptoms were related with bipolarity. So our diagnostic manuals have become very much problematic in terms of their use in reality. And leading it to the training we want people to have, both as therapists and as doctors, definitely we need to help them identify between the knowledge they will receive, which is definitely very large and overwhelming, what is relevant in their relation with others. I would say that, and I could say that soft skills, which are, we're just saying, this relational relevance, the possibility of immersion, the possibility of being with others, are for me not soft skills, they are hard skills. So they are as important skills and offering us relational cues and even information that we cannot attach if we are not aware of them. So I would say that we can consider them private, as if I am myself believing in those, but I believe that some soft skills are also universal. And again, another thing is that we live in a globalized world. So this means, I'm not sure how it is in Belgrade, but at least in Lisbon, we are overwhelmed with people which structures of morality and structures of existence are foreign to us in a way that their difference is very visible. Not just that, but a lot of young people, they communicate online. So rather than having a Portuguese existence in which they share the morality of their parents, they now have a very fluid structure of existence in which they communicate with everyone. So I believe that we have to find ways to create dialogue between this and to allow, at least in our profession, as we are health professionals, to allow people to find common ground in a world which has definitely changed. Lastly, if I understood correctly, your idea about recovery, or at least intervention in mental health, is to do with possibilities, the limits of possibilities in a social world. And Michael Musalek has something written which I like a lot, that his last definition of our role as doctors is to make the possible possible, because mental disorder removes possibilities, and we as doctors, treatment involves making the possible possible, which I really like his definition, is that lots of things will not be possible because of society, because of their illness, because of everything, and we need as doctors and therapists to allow people to increase the range of possibilities to the limits of what is possible.
Okay, do we have any more questions? What are your comments, responses? Okay, then let us thank Luis once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. And I hope we can collaborate. Please write to me if collaborations exist. And thank you for the invitation. I will not join you in the afternoon because you're speaking in Serbian and I cannot understand. So I hope you have a great conference.
Thank you again. Tune in tomorrow. We have another keynote in English. So,
Thank you. I'll see the program and I'll try to join.
okay, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.